Chapter 2248. The power of the Tao Master's prison was not only extremely strict, but also extremely forgiving. It was extremely forgiving towards all cultivators who did not go against the Tao Master's path from the upper levels to the lower levels. Even if such a cultivator displayed power and methods that exceeded this level and caused harm to other living beings, it would not care at all, nor would it punish the living beings. However, it was extremely strict towards all cultivators who went against the Tao Master's path from the upper levels to the lower levels. As long as such a cultivator displayed any methods that exceeded the limits of this level, it would naturally descend and impose the strongest punishment on him. Unless that cultivator was strong enough to restrict the power of the Tao Master's prison, just like the waxen middle-aged man from before. As soon as he appeared, he directly froze the power of the Tao Master's prison and conveniently expelled it from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. He even forcibly grabbed Senior Sister May's body that was about to enter the Tao Master's prison. After that, he casually displayed the various gains he had obtained from the sixth level without triggering any reaction from the Tao Master's prison. However, it was obvious that Senior Sister May was not as strong as the waxen middle-aged man. Under such circumstances, when he suddenly displayed the light of heaven and earth that could only be obtained from the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, it naturally triggered a reaction from the Tao Master's prison, causing the Tao Master's prison to descend its power to punish her. Luo Fan frowned as he watched the light of heaven and earth on Senior Sister May's body continuously release its own power amidst the chaos. He watched as the power of the Tao Master's prison wrapped around her and locked onto her body. Then, he watched as the power of the Tao Master's prison gradually pulled her away from the fourth level. In the end, when she completely disappeared without a trace, he could not help but be a little stunned. Was she trying to escape? It can't be. Isn't the price too high to use such a method to escape? He thought to himself, his eyes filled with shock and uncertainty. He originally thought that Senior Sister May was plotting something and intended to resist him. However, he did not expect that in the end, she would directly disappear in front of him, causing his vigilance to be completely futile. After thinking for a long time, he still couldn't figure out what was going on with Senior Sister May. In the end, he could only put this question aside. After all, Senior Sister May had already been dragged into the Tao Master's prison. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for him to directly go to the Tao Master's prison to ask her what she was thinking. In fact, even if he went all out and directly entered the Tao Master's prison, he could not be sure that he would really be able to see Senior Sister May. What a pity! He sighed. With a sway of his body, he returned to his world cluster and sat in the center of the world cluster. After thinking about it, he casually grabbed the middle-aged rogue cultivator, who had been sealed in the barrier between the levels, out and appeared in front of him. The middle-aged cultivator was still in the same state as before he was sealed, be it his thoughts, his mind, or his movements. It was as if his time had been completely frozen by Luo Fan. In fact, the middle-aged cultivator had indeed been frozen in time by Luo Fan. In the barrier between the levels, the attribute of time itself did not exist. In this way, the middle-aged cultivator's attribute of time, which was completely sealed in the barrier, was as if it did not exist. This was no different from being frozen. At this moment, the middle-aged rogue cultivator seemed to be in front of Luo Fan, and it seemed like he was no different from being released. However, in reality, he was still in a sealed state and could not move at all. Even his perception of time had been completely removed. At this moment, his thoughts were still at the moment when he was sealed. Let me see how much stronger you are compared to the disciples of the Tao Master. As he muttered, Luo Fan pressed the crude light of heaven and earth in his hand towards the middle-aged cultivator. Under his control, the barrier between the levels naturally did not have any effect on the light. The light easily penetrated the barrier and entered the middle-aged cultivator's body. After the light entered, The middle-aged cultivator's body gradually glowed. In a trance, it was as if he had suddenly turned into a sun amidst the light. The middle-aged cultivator's body gradually disintegrated and melted. Unknowingly, he had already turned into streams of air that continuously dispersed in the barrier between the levels. Shortly after, the crude light of heaven and earth began to change. The light abruptly disintegrated into billions of parts, enveloping the countless parts of the middle-aged rogue cultivator. It penetrated the barrier between the planes and shot towards the countless heavens and earths, countless worlds, and countless spacetimes in this group of worlds. The light contained the spiritual aura of the will of the world. It was so powerful that it was even more terrifying than the light of heaven and earth that Senior Sister May had cast with her complete consciousness. Suppressing the will of the middle-aged cultivator, which had been disintegrated into billions of parts, was naturally an extremely easy task. At this moment, although the middle-aged cultivator had broken away from the barrier between the levels, he was still in a daze. It was difficult for him to form effective thoughts, let alone perceive the changes in the outside world. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan easily allowed the crude light of the heavens and earth to bring the body parts of the middle-aged rogue cultivators straight into the heavens and earth, each world, each space-time, and directly integrated into the cycle of reincarnation. They turned into living creatures that lived and struggled in the heavens and earth, each world, each space-time. Although these creatures that were thrown into the reincarnation were products of billions of parts, after all, the source came from the middle-aged cultivator. They were part of a powerful cultivator who had at least come from the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. Under such circumstances, these creatures that were thrown into the various worlds, and spacetimes naturally possessed aptitudes that far surpassed the native creatures in these worlds, and spacetimes. They had far surpassed the native creatures in these worlds, and spacetimes. In the beginning, those creatures that were thrown into the reincarnation were just some low-level, unintelligent creatures. However, after several reincarnations, they had enough time to grow and absorbed enough nutrients in the reincarnation. Soon, they broke away from the low-level creatures and gained their own intelligence. With this intelligence, they began to step onto the road of cultivation at an unimaginable speed. Very soon, they reached a very high level in their respective worlds, and spacetimes. When they reached a very high level, they gradually began to realize that they were different from other cultivators in their respective worlds, and spacetimes. It was as if there was a voice in their hearts constantly reminding them that they had a mission that was far beyond the imagination of other creatures. Their existence was not just for cultivation, nor was it for improvement, but for a more noble and greater purpose. However, although they were sure that they had a mission and purpose, they could not find the root of it. They could not find their mission and purpose. Not long after, most of these body parts voluntarily threw themselves into the reincarnation and began a new round of reincarnation. Just like that, reincarnation after reincarnation, cultivation after cultivation, confusion after confusion, then a new reincarnation, a new cultivation, and a new confusion. Just like that, it formed an almost endless cycle. It was precisely because of this that the living beings transformed from the body parts of these middle-aged rogue cultivators were countless times more difficult and painful than the living beings that were born and bred in the heaven and earth, the world and the time and space, and even the rogue cultivators under the Tao Master who had been thrown into them by Luo Fan before. Is this the struggle of a half-awake and half-dreaming person? Luo Fan sighed in his heart as he sensed the struggle of these creatures in the center of the world group. Even he felt pain when he saw this struggle, let alone the many body parts that had experienced it. However, even though he felt pain when he looked at it, he did not have the slightest idea of solving the struggle of the middle-aged rogue cultivator's body parts. It was not only because the middle-aged cultivator had attacked him so many times, but also because he could clearly feel that his scattered light of heaven and earth was constantly growing. It was as if every struggle, every reincarnation, and every moment of confusion provided the light of heaven and earth with a large amount of resources to grow. The light of heaven and earth was a technique that could only be condensed at the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. For such an existence, it was already extremely rare for Luo Fan to be able to condense such a rough embryonic form. It was even more difficult for him to make it grow than for him to ascend. Under such circumstances, it was almost impossible to see the light of heaven and earth grow. Even Luo Fan himself had given up this hope. Under such circumstances, he could suddenly sense the growth of the light of heaven and earth at an unimaginable speed. It was easy to imagine how joyous it was for him. Compared to the rewards, the price to pay for such benefits was nothing more than the pain of one's enemy. Was there a need to say anything more about this decision? Why would there be growth? Luo Fan thought to himself. He immediately put aside his original plan of pulling all the rogue cultivators into his world group to help his countless worlds and spacetime grow. With a thought, his mind flashed and he was about to enter a certain world, into the traces of light of heaven and earth hidden in the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator. The light of heaven and earth seemed to be only a trace, but because it contained endless mysteries, its interior was as complex as countless worlds. Even if Luo Fan wanted to hide his entire world group within it, it would be a piece of cake for him, let alone a trace of his mind. As such, even though there was an additional trace of Luo Fan's mind in his body, the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator still did not notice anything. It continued to reincarnate, cultivate, grow, be lost, and reincarnate again. The cycle continued. This wisp of Luo Fan's mind was hidden in the light of heaven and earth, sensing the changes in this part of his body, sensing the various subtle thoughts it had during this process, as well as how the light of heaven and earth absorbed those traces of resources to strengthen itself during this process. In this world group, the flow of time in every world and spacetime was almost independent. It was not related to any time attribute in the outside world. Under such circumstances, only a few years had passed in Luo Fan's body, but tens of billions of years had passed in the world that his mind had entered. Over these tens of billions of years, the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator would cultivate to a point of confusion every 30 million years on average. He would not be able to think or even cultivate, and had no choice but to go through a new cycle of reincarnation. Just like that, the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator had reincarnated over 1,000 times over the past tens of billions of years. Luo Fan's mind, which was hidden within the wisp of light of heaven and earth in his body, saw every single change that took place in the process of over 1,000 reincarnations. He had made countless deductions and calculations about the effects of all these changes in an attempt to find the source of the growth of the light of heaven and earth. After so many reincarnations, the answer that Luo Fan needed had unknowingly appeared. It's actually because of this. When he obtained the answer, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little confused. The reason why his light of heaven and earth grew was the same reason why the living being formed by the body of the middle-aged rogue cultivator would feel lost and unable to accept it after cultivating to a certain level. It was because the traces of light of heaven and earth naturally resonated with the will of the world when they reincarnated in the world, and the space-time. The light of heaven and earth contained the spiritual aura of the will of the world. The existence of this spiritual aura represented the same kind to the will of the world. The will of the world also possessed a complete will, the ability to think, and all the characteristics that all intelligence should have. However, all of this was fundamentally different from the will of living beings. No will of living beings could understand the situation of its existence, let alone communicate with it. Under such circumstances, the will of the world would naturally communicate with it in a way that living beings could not understand when it discovered its own kind. Chapter 2249. It was this tiny light of heaven and earth that resonated with the will of heaven and earth, causing the light of heaven and earth to gradually be influenced by the will of heaven and earth and grow unknowingly. As a result, the light of heaven and earth would continue to grow as time passed as the middle-aged cultivator's body parts reincarnated. In other words, whether or not the middle-aged cultivator's body parts reincarnated did not matter to the light of heaven and earth. After figuring this out, Luo Fan thought about it again and understood why the living creature formed from the body parts of the middle-aged rogue cultivator was so different from other cultivators. It was because every time he cultivated to a certain level, he would become confused, give up everything, and reincarnate to seek his own mission, his own meaning. This was because they were affected by the light of heaven and earth, and could vaguely sense the existence of the will of heaven and earth. If they could grasp this feeling, it would naturally be extremely beneficial to them. However, with the incomplete state of the body parts, once they sensed the will of heaven and earth, they would naturally be eroded by the will of heaven and earth. Naturally, their mentality and spirit would move closer to the will of heaven and earth. From the perspective of the will of heaven and earth, such a move would naturally awaken and be gradually understood by the will of heaven and earth. However, to the will of living beings, this meant that they were at a loss. They were at a loss and could not find their own meaning. They could not find the mission that they seemed to exist for. As a result, they would reincarnate again and again in the heaven and earth, the world, and spacetime. Time and time again, they would work hard to grow, and then become lost and lost again. I didn't expect it to be like this. Luo Fan could not help but let out a long sigh when he understood all this. However, his heart was completely relaxed. Even though he knew that he had spent so many years to catch the wrong target, he did not regret it at all. After all, no matter how he had originally planned to search for the source, he had still found it in the end. He even vaguely knew how to strengthen this random growth that could only rely on luck. Under such circumstances, did it matter how much time he had spent and how many wrong directions he had caught? As for the light of heaven and earth that caused the middle-aged cultivator's body parts to suffer, he did not feel the slightest bit guilty. After all, this middle-aged rogue cultivator was his enemy no matter how he looked at it. Since they were enemies, they naturally could use any means. Even if Luo Fan were to kill him directly, it would not be excessive, let alone let him suffer some undeserved calamity. With a thought, he waved his hand. The strands of light of the world that had fused with the middle-aged itinerant cultivator's body left his body and quickly gathered towards his body. In the blink of an eye, it had already gathered into a weak candle flame in his hand. Compared to before, although this light was still at the candlelight level, the spiritual aura within it was several times stronger than before. With the power that every bit of spiritual aura could exert, this candlelight could clearly exert a terrifying power that was several times or even dozens of times stronger than before. Sensing the changes in the light of heaven and earth, his heart moved slightly. With a point of his finger, the light of heaven and earth entered the endless group of worlds around him. In a small spacetime, it directly turned into a wisp of the rules of that spacetime. It began to interact with the countless other rules of that spacetime. It gradually integrated into that spacetime, and was incorporated into its own operating system by the great Tao of spacetime. Along with this operating system, it gradually formed a closer and closer connection with the will of the world that even Luo Fan could not directly contact. Under Luo Fan's will, the flow of time in this spacetime began to accelerate rapidly. When 3 years had passed in his body, the time in that space-time had already passed for billions of years. After billions of years of contact and influence, the light of heaven and earth had grown many times. If it was gathered together, although the light still belonged to a candle flame, it had changed from a birthday candle to a candlelight dinner candle. As for the spiritual aura contained in it, it had also grown greatly. Even if it was still a spiritual aura, it was several times stronger than before. Compared to when it was scattered into the countless heavens and earths, worlds, and spacetime, it was several times faster. Looks like this method is indeed effective. Sensing that the light of heaven and earth's growth in that spacetime had been restricted, Luo Fan knew that it was time to change places. Immediately, he raised his hand and beckoned. The light of heaven and earth that had been fused with this spacetime for tens of billions of years directly separated itself from the layer of laws and laws it resided in. It then left the spacetime and came directly to Luo Fan's palm, gathering into a candle flame that was several times stronger than before. Then, with a thought from Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth charged into another spacetime and began a process similar to the last time. Through various subtle changes, it finally connected with the will of heaven and earth in this spacetime, learning from the will of heaven and earth and gradually improving itself. Just like that, the years of his main body's life and the billions of years in that spacetime passed. The much stronger light of the world once again left that world and returned to Luo Fan's body, falling into his palm once again. With another turn, it entered another spacetime. Just like that, several years passed, and then several years, and then several years. Unknowingly, millions of years had passed. During these millions of years, the light of heaven and earth would complete a growth in a certain spacetime, a certain world, or even a certain part of the world every few years. Every time it grew, it would bring great benefits to the light of heaven and earth, causing the light of heaven and earth to grow to become as dazzling as the sun. It seemed to be even more powerful than the light of heaven and earth that Senior Sister May, the middle-aged independent cultivator, and even the waxen middle-aged man could unleash. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth floated in Luo Fan's hand, but it could no longer shrink in his palm like a candle flame like before. Instead, it released endless light and illuminated his surroundings. It even looked like a sun had appeared out of nowhere in this cluster of worlds. However, although the light had become so powerful, the spirituality in the light of heaven and earth was still at the level of aura. In other words, it still did not have a complete will of heaven and earth. It was still just the spirituality of the will of heaven and earth. This had been going on for a long time in the recent cycles of the heavens and earth. From the beginning, Luo Fan had chosen heaven and earth, worlds, and spacetimes for the light of heaven and earth according to the order of time. In other words, it was according to the time period when he first created these worlds, and spacetimes. The spacetimes and worlds he chose at the beginning were the spacetimes, small 1,000 worlds, and medium 1,000 worlds that he created before he even reached the innate zenith heaven. After that, the light of heaven and earth grew and improved again and again. Then, he pushed back time and put it into the spacetime or world that was created after the time period represented by the chosen spacetime or world. It was only when he could no longer gain anything from the levels of these worlds and could no longer allow the light of heaven and earth to grow further did he toss it aside and choose the next level of spacetime and worlds. He did this over and over again. Most recently, he had chosen the worlds and worlds he had created on his path to becoming a Tao Master. Even so, he sensed that the growth of the light of heaven and earth's spiritual aura had stagnated. This made him understand that he probably couldn't use this method to transform the light of heaven and earth's essence and make it complete from its fragmented state. This could not help but make him a little annoyed. However, he only felt annoyed for a while before he recovered. After all, he was now only at the 4th level of the Tao Master Path. Compared to the cultivators who had entered the 5th level of the Tao Master Path, he still lacked the corresponding cultivation environment. Under such circumstances, it was actually an incredible achievement to be able to condense the light of heaven and earth to this extent. If he wanted to make the light of heaven and earth completely ignore the original restrictions and completely take shape at the 4th level, it would obviously be too greedy. The accumulation can no longer have an effect on the light of heaven and earth. I'm afraid that only a great stimulation can make it complete the last step of transformation. Luo Fan looked at the light of heaven and earth that was like the sun for a long time, and then let out a long sigh. At this moment, the power of the light of heaven and earth had already reached an unimaginable level. In contrast, the power of the group of worlds, and even the power of the product formed by the combination of the mysteries of the first 4 levels of the Tao Master Path, were nothing. At this moment, if he encountered his old self, he would definitely be able to completely erase his old self without even lifting a finger. This was the case both in reality and in all other levels. After 1,000,000 years of development, the situation at the 4th level of the Tao Master Path was different from before. Although 1,000,000 years was not a long time for cultivators, it was more than enough for them to sort out an orderly theory and change their original wrong ideas. In this way, they had studied clearly the danger of being devoured and assimilated by the creation power that they had been panicking about. After studying this clearly, the countless independent cultivators who had been hiding in the many groups of worlds or struggling to resist the creation power came out one by one. They either worked hard to open up their own groups of worlds or began to work hard to cultivate in their own groups of worlds that had been formed for 1,000,000 years. Because of this, the 4th level of the Tao Master's Path, which was originally like the end of the world, was now thriving. It seemed to be even more lively and vigorous than the Tao Master's domain. Even though countless independent cultivators had almost condensed their own groups of worlds, Luo Fan's group of worlds was still the most conspicuous scene in the entire 4th level of the Tao Master Path. The group of worlds itself was incomparably large, far larger than the group of worlds of ordinary independent cultivators. Coupled with the hundreds of millions of worlds around the group of worlds and the even larger whirlpool in the outside world, it even seemed to occupy a third or fourth of the entire 4th level of the Tao Master Path. With such an existence standing in the 4th level, countless independent cultivators naturally regarded it as the center of the entire 4th level. Unknowingly, their own groups of worlds began to build in all directions around this position. Under such circumstances, the entire 4th level now looked like a huge galaxy, densely dotted with countless stars. Amidst the endless pitch-black power of creation, there were wisps of blood-red smoke that wandered within the endless power of creation. There were all kinds of strange emotions that constantly revealed themselves. Everywhere it passed, images, worlds, and expanses of spacetime appeared. There were all sorts of strange noises that echoed in the world of creation energy. What a pity, if only he had seen through the truth earlier. This was the voice of the independent cultivator, mourning for his friend who had died in the creation power. Damn it, if it weren't for you, how could Brotherly have died? This was the voice of the independent cultivator, blaming someone for pulling his friend out of the creation power. Alas, my poor son. This was the voice of his children who had died in it. All kinds of resentment, accompanied by the blood-red smoke, wandered endlessly in the entire 4th level of the Tao Master Path. And this blood-red smoke suddenly entered a group of worlds, turning into many worlds, and spacetime, causing a disaster that was close to a catastrophe. Then, it suddenly entered the heart of a certain cultivator, wreaking havoc in his mind, almost causing him to suffer from chi deviation. These were the various regrets, pain, and negative emotions of countless cultivators. Because they were too powerful, they were eventually seized by the endless creation power, and became the basis for some creation power, causing the creation power to produce changes that were similar to those in the group of worlds. It also gave these negative emotions something to rely on, becoming a kind of existence that would never be worn out or consumed. It began to vent on all living beings that it could come into contact with. Chapter 2250. The blood-red smoke was like a virus in the mortal world. No matter what it came into contact with, it would deteriorate. Whether it was the worlds, the itinerant cultivators, or the creation energy. Because of this, even though the blood-red mist itself wasn't huge, it continued to expand as time passed. It was as if it was growing at every moment. Every time it came into contact with a world group formed by an itinerant cultivator, it would cause great damage to the world group. At the same time, it would also suffer slight wear and tear, causing it to shrink a little. Of course, compared to the shrinking of the blood-red smoke, the itinerant cultivator's world group suffered great damage. Even the world group that suffered the least damage had 1/10 of the worlds and spacetime completely destroyed. As a result, the itinerant cultivator that formed the world group had no choice but to immerse himself in the creation energy again. He used the power of the creation energy to grab the worlds, and spacetime that belonged to him in the river of time, and slowly recover the various memories that he had lost due to the destruction of the world group. In comparison, the itinerant cultivator's loss from the blood-red smoke was much greater than the loss of the world group. For the itinerant cultivators, being engulfed by the blood-red smoke was equivalent to losing half of their lives. Not a single itinerant cultivator would truly die from the countless negative emotions contained in the blood-red smoke. However, not a single itinerant cultivator could remain unharmed from the corrosion of the smoke either. Even the strongest itinerant cultivator, even the most determined itinerant cultivator, became muddle-headed under the corrosion of the blood-red smoke. It was as if they were completely controlled by the blood-red smoke, and they were almost swept along by the smoke to provide assistance to it. Fortunately, although the smoke itself was extremely powerful, it was still smoke in the end. Due to the chaos in itself, it was unable to perfectly unleash its power. Naturally, it was unable to turn those independent cultivators into evil beings. It could only bring chaos to those independent cultivators, causing them to stay where they were and fall into a state of chi deviation. Only when the blood-red mist had truly left and no longer affected the wandering cultivator did the wandering cultivator regain a bit of his mind and reason. Only then did he try his best to expel the residual side effects of the blood-red mist and recover with great difficulty. However, it was obvious that the blood-red mist's restriction was only temporary. After all, apart from when it invaded a certain world cluster or a certain wandering cultivator, the blood-red mist was growing and strengthening at every moment. Unknowingly, the blood-red mist had already gained intelligence and was able to sort out its own power. There were also brilliant people among the itinerant cultivators. Very quickly, some of the rogue cultivators noticed this trend. The fact that these individual cultivators had found out about this was a matter that concerned all the individual cultivators on the 4th level of the path to Tao Master. Naturally, he could not keep this a secret. Not long after, he had already publicized this trend to the extent that all the rogue cultivators on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path were aware of it. We can't let it continue to grow, otherwise all of us may be devoured by it. This was the final conclusion of many of the rogue cultivators. Such a conclusion made many of the rogue cultivators hate the blood-red mist and feel a headache at the same time. The strangeness of the blood-red mist was beyond the imagination of all the rogue cultivators. It was clearly just a product condensed from negative emotions. Normally speaking, it should not have any power and should not be able to affect any of them. However, they did not expect that under the blessing of the creation power, the negative emotions would undergo such an incredible evolution. In the end, it had become an enemy that they could not do anything about, and a hidden danger that could destroy all of them. This development had really subverted their worldview, and they did not know how to destroy it for a while. This was also because they were not knowledgeable enough, so they felt that it was strange. If they knew that there was a layer called the universe of negative emotions in the state of chaos, and that even true saints did not dare to enter it easily and had to rely on the construction of the transportation network that connected the various worlds to travel, they would know that this kind of evolution of the negative emotions in the creation power was really normal. After all, the creation power was originally a kind of power with a large number of characteristics of the state of chaos. Such a power existed here, coupled with a strong enough negative emotion, produced this kind of fundamental transformation, turning this kind of negative emotion into a hidden danger at this time. This was really reasonable. It could even be imagined that, if this blood-red mist continued to develop into a universe of negative emotions and completely enveloped the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, it would not be impossible for this level to become similar to the universe of negative emotions in the state of chaos. It is condensed from negative emotions, we may be able to reconcile it with positive emotions. This was a solution that many rogue cultivators came up with after various discussions. After all, the existence of negative emotions and positive emotions was completely opposite. If there was too strong a negative emotion, as long as corresponding positive emotions were added to it, it could become normal. Similarly, no matter how strong the positive emotion was, the positive emotion would be offset by the corresponding negative emotion. For example, if an ordinary person won a big prize of tens of millions of yuan, he would naturally have a strong positive emotion that was even strong enough to make the heart of a relatively weak person collapse. However, if at the same time, he was told that he had a terminal illness, that he could not spend all the money, and that he might die, this would inevitably make him have a stronger negative emotion. When these two factors were superimposed, the previous positive emotion that had been generated because of the big prize would naturally disappear without a trace. This basic principle was known even by ordinary people, let alone these rogue cultivators who had cultivated to the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Naturally, they were more clear about it. In fact, they had a deeper understanding of this than ordinary people. They had an almost perfect understanding and control of how much positive emotion to use and what kind of positive emotion to use. For example, if it was also an ordinary person who won a big prize, they would use negative emotions to neutralize the positive emotions generated by the prize. However, they would not tell him that he had a terminal illness, which was the biggest source of negative emotions, to completely suppress the positive emotions, or even cause a rebound. They would definitely choose one very precisely, such as the negative emotion of their wife having an affair, to accurately neutralize the positive emotion. In the end, the positive emotion would completely disappear without causing any backlash, so that the ordinary person would not be too happy, but would not be too sad either. Because they had such a deep understanding of the principle of neutralization, when these rogue cultivators thought of this method at this time, they were all confident that this method would definitely succeed, and would definitely be able to completely neutralize the blood-red smoke. It was precisely because of this confidence that this method was quickly adopted by many rogue cultivators after it came up. Immediately, countless rogue cultivators began to communicate with each other, creating a method to condense positive emotions, and spreading it to countless rogue cultivators in countless worlds. At the same time, this method was spread to many itinerant cultivators. What kind of positive emotions did each itinerant cultivator need to condense? How many positive emotions did they need to condense? How to combine these positive emotions? And how to combine this combination with other itinerant cultivators' combinations. Just like that, this step alone was already so complicated that even a false saint might not be able to do it perfectly. However, it was obvious that this was not a problem for many experts who had undergone the fourth tribulation here. In just a few days they had completely mastered this method. All rogue cultivators had already obtained a combination of positive emotions, and were ready to start the final combination to completely neutralize the blood-red smoke. The blood-red smoke did not enter any world group in these days, nor did it affect any rogue cultivators. Therefore, compared to a few days ago, there was not much change. At least, it did not exceed the rogue cultivators' expectations. In other words, it was still within the range of the various countermeasures that the rogue cultivators had originally prepared. Under such circumstances, after countless confirmations, the rogue cultivators finally breathed a sigh of relief and decided to continue using the method that they had originally discussed. "Hurry up, it's almost at my world group," a rogue cultivator shouted at this time, his voice filled with inexplicable panic. Not far away from him, the blood-red smoke was already surging, slowly creeping towards his world group. The expressions of the other rogue cultivators turned solemn when they heard his words. Apart from the rogue cultivator who was about to face danger, many other rogue cultivators did not care much about the impending doom of the rogue cultivator. As long as it did not affect them, even if all the rogue cultivators on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path died, it would not affect them. However, even if they did not care about this, these rogue cultivators could not sit back and watch the blood-red smoke pour into the world group. After all, if the blood-red smoke entered the world group, its nature would definitely change. At that time, wouldn't all the preparations that they had made before be completely useless? Wouldn't they have to start all over again? Wouldn't all of them be in danger of being affected by the blood-red smoke? With this understanding, it could not be more obvious what they would do. In an instant, the avatars formed from the positive emotions of the rogue cultivators quickly shot towards the blood-red smoke from all directions. After so many years, the rogue cultivators' understanding of the nature of the creation power had become quite profound. Naturally, they also knew that the time attribute within the creation power did not have much connection with the outside world. Therefore, at this time, the combination of their positive emotions that they had condensed with the help of the unique time attribute within the creation power. In a flash, they had already penetrated the endless creation power, almost as if they did not need to experience time, and had already appeared around the blood-red smoke at the same time. Although the blood-red smoke had developed for such a long time, it was still developing according to its own instincts. How could it compare to the product that the rogue cultivators had actively condensed? At this moment, before the combination of the positive emotions truly came into contact with the blood-red smoke, the countless combinations had already fused together and formed a complete circle around the blood-red smoke, directly enveloping it within. Due to the contact, the countless combinations of the positive emotions began to produce an extremely intense reaction. Amidst the intense reaction, the countless positive emotions fused, complemented each other, and strengthened each other. In the end, they fused into one at an unimaginable speed, forming a faint blue smoke. The faint blue smoke gave off a completely different feeling compared to the blood-red smoke formed by the combination of negative emotions. The blood-red smoke gave off an extremely uncomfortable feeling. Looking at it was like listening to countless people expressing their regrets, pain, anger, hatred, and sorrow. Anyone who saw this light blue smoke would feel a positive emotion welling up in their hearts. It was as if countless people were talking about their joy, their excitement, their pride, their kinship, their friendship, and their love. When these two different existences came into contact with each other, an earth-shattering change occurred in an instant. When the blood-red smoke and the blue smoke came into contact, endless terrifying shockwaves spread out continuously. The Genesis energy was frantically devoured and changed during this process. Then, it was carried by the shockwaves and scattered in all directions. In the end, it crashed into the Genesis energy, collapsed, and disappeared. During this process, both the blood-red smoke and the faint blue smoke were constantly being consumed. It was as if they were undergoing the neutralization that the rogue cultivators had expected. Success? When the rogue cultivators sensed this, their hearts were filled with inexplicable joy and excitement. They all felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. As long as this plan succeeded, they would no longer have to worry about the danger that the blood-red smoke formed by the negative emotions would bring them. From now on, they would be able to cultivate independently and safely for a long time. They would no longer have to worry about any external forces affecting their cultivation. Just as the rogue cultivators were secretly rejoicing, a strange existence suddenly appeared out of nowhere in the blood-red smoke and the faint blue smoke. Chapter 22:51. Between the blood-red mist and the faint blue mist, there was an extremely strange gray mist. As soon as the gray mist appeared, it instantly suppressed the impact from the collision between the blood-red mist and the faint blue mist. It was as if a huge hand had instantly pressed down on two jumping ants on the ground. In that instant, the shock waves that were constantly being released in all directions froze in an instant. Then, the shock waves bounced back, and as if they were being pulled by a black hole, they charged madly towards the gray smoke, disappearing into it in the blink of an eye. Even the shock wave that was sent so far away was like this, not to mention the reaction of the light blue and blood-red smoke that was closer to the explosion. In an instant, when the numerous attacks charged towards the gray smoke, more than half of the pale blue smoke and the blood-red smoke had already been devoured by the gray smoke. After devouring the two mist that made up its body, the gray mist began to expand at a crazy speed. From its original state of strands, it had expanded to the size of the blood-red mist and the faint blue mist in the blink of an eye. As it grew to this stage, the attractive force within it had also increased by countless times. In the blink of an eye, it had devoured all of the blood-red mist and the faint blue mist. What's going on? Why is there such a strange thing? The itinerant cultivators roared in shock and bewilderment. Among them, the most frantic and fearful one was none other than the owner of the world cluster that was not far away from the gray mist. At this moment, the gray mist had already devoured all the smoke and impact. However, even under such circumstances, the gray mist did not stop. Instead, it began to madly shoot forward in the direction that the blood-red mist was originally moving in. In the blink of an eye, it had already crossed the range of the world creation energy and arrived before the world group. It crashed into it and began to devour everything within the world group. It even devoured all the living beings within, including the rogue cultivator. Facing the terrifying devouring force, the itinerant cultivator was indescribably terrified. As he struggled, he screamed with all his might. The screams were indescribably mournful, causing the other itinerant cultivators' hair to stand on end. They felt as if the end of the world had arrived. It's countless times stronger than before. This was the judgment that the itinerant cultivators made when they saw the devouring force of the gray mist. Perhaps we've done something that will make us regret it. At this moment, the itinerant cultivators murmured with fear in their eyes. Although they were confident, they did not think that they could easily get rid of the wandering cultivator who was now screaming miserably. The fact that the gray mist could get rid of the itinerant cultivator so easily meant that they wouldn't be able to put up much resistance against it. In fact, they might even be weaker than the itinerant cultivator. Under such circumstances, when they saw the smoke devouring the world and the rogue cultivator, they were naturally worried if they would also be devoured by the smoke in the following period of time. Their hearts were filled with terror at the thought of this outcome. Each of them felt an indescribable fear. "What should we do now?" one of the itinerant cultivators murmured. Following his words, everyone fell silent. This silence was because everyone was at their wits' end. They planned to stop talking, stop lamenting, and stop feeling afraid, and wait for someone else to come up with a solution. The appearance of this silence made all the itinerant cultivators feel even more despair. This meant that none of the itinerant cultivators could think of a way to deal with the gray mist. Faced with this situation, the itinerant cultivators were all stunned. A feeling of despair began to rise in the hearts of the itinerant cultivators. This feeling of despair was a negative emotion to begin with. After it appeared, it was transmitted to the gray smoke through some mysterious channel, causing the gray smoke to grow continuously in the process. As it grew stronger, it devoured the world group and the itinerant cultivators, becoming stronger and more terrifying. As it grew stronger, it made the itinerant cultivators feel even more despair, causing the gray mist to be replenished even more. Just like that, it formed an endless cycle. "Now, there's only one way," one of the itinerant cultivators said at some point in time. In this absolutely silent and oppressive atmosphere, Although the itinerant cultivator was only trying to suggest a solution and didn't make a loud announcement, it was enough to attract the attention of all the other itinerant cultivators. This was because all the itinerant cultivators shifted their attention from the gray mist to the itinerant cultivator who spoke. The negative emotions that were constantly appearing in their hearts naturally began to dissipate. On the contrary, even though they hadn't heard what the solution was, they couldn't help but feel a strong sense of hope in their hearts. And this hope was obviously a positive emotion. Just one sentence was enough to turn despair into hope. It was easy to imagine how chaotic the itinerant cultivator's emotions were right now. However, at this moment, the positive emotions still couldn't escape the fate of being transmitted to the gray mist through the mysterious channel. They were devoured by the gray mist and became the gray mist's nourishment. Don't forget, in addition to the blood-red smoke formed by negative emotions, there was also the light blue smoke formed by positive emotions. The basic composition of these two types of mist caused both positive and negative emotions to become the gray mist's nourishment, becoming existences that could be devoured by the gray mist. It was precisely because of this that at this moment, regardless of whether the itinerant cultivators were happy or sad, hopeful or despairing, they couldn't change the fact that the gray mist was growing at every moment. It could be predicted that if this continued, the gray mist would grow completely after a period of time and turn into a strange universe that was formed from both positive and negative emotions. The different emotions of the itinerant cultivators, whether there were more negative or more positive emotions, would at most affect which emotion would eventually gain the upper hand in the strange universe that would eventually take shape. It wouldn't be able to change the shape of the strange universe. However, this was clearly not what the itinerant cultivators were concerned about. What they were concerned about was the only way to solve the problem that the rogue cultivator had mentioned. If we can't handle it ourselves, then we can only ask for help, the itinerant cultivator said with a complicated expression. He wasn't sure when he said this. One could easily hear the hesitation in his voice. It was as if he also thought that the possibility of this solution succeeding was not very high. The other itinerant cultivators felt like they were struck by lightning when they heard his word. Ask for help. Ask him for help? This thought echoed in their minds. Although the itinerant cultivator didn't say who he was asking for help for, none of the itinerant cultivators were stupid. How could they not know that there could only be one person they were asking for help for? That person was the powerful being who had created the river of creation and caused the entire itinerant cultivator territory to be engulfed by the power of creation. In the end, many of the itinerant cultivators died because they weren't familiar with the power of creation. He was an itinerant cultivator who seemed to have come from a higher level. There was not a single person among them who did not fear that powerful existence. After so many years, they had benefited greatly from the means of that powerful being, which allowed them to own their own world group and start their real cultivation on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, they had already seen clearly that the expert was nothing to them. He was only doing this to achieve some ulterior motive. Under such circumstances, how could they not be afraid of that expert? Even the most open-minded person could clearly see the huge vortex formed by countless world group in the center of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The existence of the huge vortex represented that the expert was carrying out some unimaginable plan, or even conspiracy. Under such circumstances, asking them to ask for help from that expert was like asking a chef for help from a fish on the chopping board. No matter how they thought about it, they couldn't accept such a situation easily. Due to these complicated emotions, all the rogue cultivators fell into a dilemma after hearing the rogue cultivator's suggestion. Silence once again shrouded the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, compared to the previous silence that was filled with despair, the current silence lacked that feeling of despair. Of course, although there was less despair, the other emotions were still endless. pain, hesitation, doubt, displeasure, anger, fear, helplessness. In the end, through all kinds of subtle and mysterious channels, these emotions directly penetrated the power of creation, penetrated all barriers, and were injected into the gray smoke. Abruptly and soundlessly, the world cluster was devoured by the gray smoke. Even the owner of the world group, the itinerant cultivator, was completely submerged in the gray smoke. He became an insignificant, tiny black dot, drifting aimlessly inside the gray smoke. This situation clearly showed that the itinerant cultivator had been completely usurped by the gray smoke and had completely dedicated himself to the smoke. After that, the gray smoke had no intention of stopping at all. Instead, it rushed straight in another direction. It wasn't a direction that was empty, but a direction that led to another world group of itinerant cultivators. This situation was obviously completely different from the blood-red smoke. The blood-red smoke that was derived from negative emotions moved in random directions. Unless it gathered very close, it wouldn't be attracted by any world group or any itinerant cultivator. In contrast, the behavior of the gray smoke had proved that it was more dangerous and difficult to resist than the blood-red smoke. In the face of this situation, the panic in the hearts of the itinerant cultivators finally reached a certain limit, completely suppressing the various conflicts that originally existed in their hearts. They finally made up their minds to ask for help from the expert with ulterior motives. Damn it! Hurry up! Hurry up! It's coming for me! Among them, the desperate roar of an itinerant cultivator that made even the itinerant cultivators shiver after hearing it gave them enough motivation to really make a decision. Although they had already made the decision to ask for help, they still had to think about how to ask for help. After all, the expert was inside the incomparably huge vortex in the center of the fourth level, and he wasn't directly in front of them. The other party wouldn't respond as long as they shouted loudly. If they wanted to ask for help, they would need to put in a lot of effort. As for whether that expert would save them or not, they didn't have much to worry about. After all, the various arrangements and plans of that expert clearly weren't just for the sake of watching them die. Clearly, it was for the sake of seeing that they would be able to bring corresponding benefits to that expert during this process. Under such circumstances, it was obviously not in their interests to be completely devoured by the gray smoke. Therefore, they believed that the powerhouse would definitely save them. As for whether he could save them or not, they were even less worried. All the itinerant cultivators knew how powerful the barrier between the domain of the Tao Master and the domain of the itinerant cultivators was. But now, even such a powerful barrier was so easily destroyed by that expert. One could only imagine how powerful that expert was. Although the gray smoke was terrifying, it was definitely not as powerful as the barrier that separated the Tao Master's domain and the rogue cultivator's domain. Since the expert could easily get rid of the barrier, he could naturally get rid of the gray smoke and save all of them. Chapter 2252. At this moment, the itinerant cultivators quickly took action after a discussion. They gathered their strength and blasted it towards the vortex in the center from all directions. The surges of energy contained their strongest wills and their greatest pleas. In an instant, they had already penetrated the boundless creation energy and collided with the huge vortex. It was a pity that this strength was insignificant compared to the vortex. One must know that the vortex was a huge vortex that enveloped countless worlds. The amount of creation energy contained in such an existence was unimaginable to ordinary itinerant cultivators. The terrifying power of creation itself was already the most powerful defense. Currently, Luo Fan was completely immersed in comprehending the light of heaven and earth, and did not pay any attention to the outside world at all. In this way, how could the impact of the power that could not even shake the entire vortex attract his attention? When the itinerant cultivators saw that their strength was like a clay ox entering the sea and did not cause any disturbance, and the powerhouse inside did not react to it at all, they could not help but feel a growing sense of fear. They were originally wondering if they should seek help from the powerhouse, but they did not expect that the powerhouse would not be in the mood to care about them now that they had made up their minds. They couldn't help but feel that their previous worries were groundless. Facing such a change, the fear in the itinerant cultivators' hearts grew stronger. In particular, the itinerant cultivator who was extremely terrified earlier was now engulfed by the gray smoke. His world group was almost completely devoured by the gray smoke, and his body was gradually submerged in the gray smoke. When he stood side by side with the itinerant cultivator that was devoured before, the fear and despair became even more intense and intense. "What should we do now?" the itinerant cultivators mumbled with fear in their eyes. "Attack again." A itinerant cultivator gritted his teeth and roared. With this roar, he took the initiative to gather the strongest power and might that he could release and directly blasted it towards the vortex in the center, which was where Luo Fan's world group was located. This attack had clearly surpassed ordinary creation energy. If it were to strike any other itinerant cultivator's world group, it would definitely cause a huge impact on the world group. The world group would not be able to withstand the attack and would suffer visible damage. However, at this moment, when the attack charged into the vortex, it did not even cause any disturbance to the vortex itself. The vortex easily twisted and devoured it completely. Seeing this, the itinerant cultivator was not discouraged at all. Or rather, he became even more frenzied. The power around him surged as he controlled the world group to release some kind of power that fused with his own power and blasted it towards the vortex in the center. At this moment, the other itinerant cultivators also seemed to have woken up from a dream. "That's right, our attacks might seem very powerful to us, but to that powerhouse, our attacks are nothing. Even if we attack with our full strength, we might not be able to sense it. How can we show mercy and not use our full strength?" Immediately, more and more itinerant cultivators joined the group of itinerant cultivators who attacked first. They began to gather their strongest power and might, and even the subtle power abstracted from the world group they had formed, and blasted it towards the vortex in the center. However, no matter how many times they attacked, no matter how fast they attacked, they did not cause any ripples on the vortex. When all the attacks rushed into the vortex, they were easily crushed by the endless power of creation above the vortex. The attacks were turned into countless fragments and completely integrated into the power of creation. In the end, they disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared. Faced with such a situation, the itinerant cultivators were panicking and in despair, but they did not dare to slow down. Instead, they stimulated their power to extract the power that belonged to the cluster of worlds that they had comprehended recently and added it to their attack. They sent their power towards the vortex in the center and bombarded it. As time went by, more and more itinerant cultivators joined the group. The vortex in the center looked like it was emitting countless beams of light, and the whole appearance had changed. Of course, this was only at a glance. If one took a closer look, they would find that it was not the vortex that was emitting light, but the countless beams of light that were shooting into the vortex. At the same time as the itinerant cultivators, the gray smoke that was constantly wreaking havoc in the fourth level of the Tao Master's path was also moving. Every few hours, the gray smoke would devour a world group and completely devour an itinerant cultivator. As for itself, as it devoured, every few hours it would leap and grow explosively. It had only been a few days since the beginning, but it had grown many times. It could originally only pierce into a world group like a sharp thorn, but now it could even devour an entire world group like a python. This speed of growth made the itinerant cultivators feel almost completely hopeless, and this despair once again turned into the growth of the gray smoke, causing it to grow faster and faster, making it even more of a deterrent to the itinerant cultivators. Now, all the itinerant cultivators were already doing their best to move their world groups away from the gray smoke, wanting to escape from it. Some itinerant cultivators who were closer to the gray smoke even directly abandoned their world groups and moved towards other itinerant cultivators' world groups, wanting to enter them to escape from the disaster of the gray smoke. Of course, this was obviously an extremely stupid decision. After all, ever since the world groups were established, they were already closely related to their past. For them, the damage to the world groups was equivalent to the damage to their past. In the end, once the world groups were destroyed, they would also suffer extremely terrifying damage. Even if their bodies seemed unharmed, their consciousness and life source would be almost completely annihilated. In this way, the itinerant cultivators hiding in other cultivators' world groups would only be left as walking corpses. If the existence that took in the itinerant cultivator was ruthless, it could even directly seize everything from the itinerant cultivator and turn his body into a puppet. However, it was clear that these rogue cultivators would normally be interested in this. They would be interested in strengthening their own strength and technique. However, at this time, their own lives were under great threat, and this kind of growth was not beneficial to them at all. Obviously, they would not have such thoughts at this time, even if there were many good materials for refining puppets in front of them. They simply ignored them and poured all their energy, wisdom, and abilities into attacking the vortex in the center. They did everything they could to stir up the whirlpool. They wanted the supreme expert in the depths of the whirlpool to discover their dangerous situation and save them. It could be said that after such a long time, this hope had almost turned into their faith. Damn it, why can't the world groups be moved from their roots? Some itinerant cultivators cried out in extreme pain. These were the itinerant cultivators who were already targeted by the gray smoke and could be completely devoured by it in the next instant. Ever since the world groups were created, they had been fixed in place and could not be moved. Even if one used all sorts of special methods and cultivated all sorts of indescribable cultivation methods to move the world cluster slightly, there was still a great limit to how much one could do. Moreover, the techniques and power required were not things that itinerant cultivators could achieve. Given the itinerant cultivators' current understanding of the world groups, not many of them could even project the world groups, let alone abstract the power of the world groups from the world group. How could they even hope to move the world groups away from the threat of the gray smoke? Following this almost despairing roar, what followed was their incomparably painful screams. Clearly, their predictions were correct. The gray smoke quickly pounced on them and devoured their world groups, causing their world groups to be rapidly corroded by the gray smoke. At the same time, the itinerant cultivators were also being corroded by the gray smoke. The threat of death was an incomparably powerful stimulus for any cultivator. However, this stimulus had a certain effect on stimulating one's potential. Of course, this was only for a small portion of the cultivators. For most of the cultivators, every step they took at this stage was already breaking their limits and trying their best to reshape their limit. Stimulating one's potential was almost impossible for them. Therefore, to them, the threat of death could only bring them pain. Only a small portion of cultivators, due to certain previous understandings and inspirations, had molded their potential to be stronger than their current realm. In other words, they had molded their limits to be stronger than they were now. Under such circumstances, the threat of death was like stimulating their potential, causing their progress to be many times faster than usual. Due to this difference, the attacks of the many itinerant cultivators attacking the vortex of the creation force at the center began to subconsciously differ. In the end, the itinerant cultivators who could stimulate their potential in the face of death gradually stood out. Their attacks gradually gained the upper hand against the attacks of the many itinerant cultivators. They gradually became the most eye-catching part of all the attacks. At their level, any improvement in their realm would bring about an earth-shattering increase in their strength. At this moment, the effects of the itinerant cultivators who stood out on the vortex of the creation force finally began to appear. Along with their attacks, faint ripples gradually appeared on the vortex, Although the ripples were faint and weak, and could not even reach the depths of the vortex, they were captured by Luo Fan's world cluster and sensed by him. However, compared to before, when there was no reaction at all, this was already many times stronger. The itinerant cultivators had placed all their hopes on the vortex. Although the change was small, it did not escape the senses of the itinerant cultivators. At this moment, the itinerant cultivators quickly understood what they should do. At this moment, the itinerant cultivators who were much stronger than ordinary itinerant cultivators began to consciously cooperate. Their attacks gradually intertwined in the void, complementing each other and promoting each other. In the end, with attacks that were many times stronger than before, they brazenly smashed into the vortex, causing more ripples than before. The appearance of the ripples gave the other itinerant cultivators even more hope. They began to give up on their original independence, and completely adjusted their attacks to the same state as the attacks of the itinerant cultivators who still had their potential stimulated in the face of life and death. They tried their best to cooperate with the attacks, and used all their efforts to help the attacks to slightly increase the impact of their attacks. Under such circumstances, the vortex that was originally filled with countless rays of light in all directions began to change its shape. From the countless rays of light, it turned into a beam of light that was countless times larger than before, and it directly pierced into the depths of the vortex from one direction. Many itinerant cultivators had different paths of cultivation, and their world clusters were worlds apart. They were abstracted from the world clusters, and the power of the world clusters had their own characteristic. The attacks that were triggered from their own paths of cultivation also had their own mysteries. Under such circumstances, it was obviously extremely difficult to perfectly combine all of their attacks and reduce the conflict between their attacks to a negligible state. As a result, they spent tens of thousands of waves of attacks before they barely managed to unify all of their attacks. Only then did they barely manage to combine all of their attacks into one, surpassing the combined effect of their scattered attacks on the whirlpool. At this moment, an unprecedented ripple finally appeared on the vortex. It was the size of a world cluster, but compared to the entire vortex, it was still an extremely insignificant ripple. The appearance of this ripple instantly caused the entire whirlpool to tremble slightly. Chapter 2253. It's a success. At this moment, all the itinerant cultivators could not help but have this thought. What came with this thought was an indescribable sense of relief. It was as if he had finally grasped a strand of hope that fell from the sky in the midst of extreme despair. However, even at this point, not a single one of them dared to do nothing and just wait. Instead, they hurriedly sent waves of cries for help towards the vortex through various methods. In the blink of an eye, all of them entered the vortex. This situation seemed to be very similar to the first action they took at the beginning, but they believed that the current situation must be completely different from before. Sure enough, just as they transmitted their thoughts over, they sensed that the supreme gaze seemed to change slightly. Then, the vortex trembled slightly, and a figure, an extremely tall and sacred figure in the eyes of countless itinerant cultivators, slowly walked out from the center of the vortex. It's really a success. At this time, the itinerant cultivators really confirmed this fact, and all of them looked relaxed. Of course, not all of them could relax. Those itinerant cultivators who were now suffering from the engulfment of the gray smoke could not completely relax like the other itinerant cultivators. After all, the reason why they could still hold on now was that they did not relax, and they were doing their best to resist. If they were to relax like this, what awaited them would probably be the entire world group, their entire bodies, their entire minds, and everything else would be completely engulfed by the gray smoke. To actually create such a thing, should I say that you guys are lucky or unlucky? The figure murmured at this time. Although his voice was not loud, it had spread throughout the entire fourth level of the Tao Master Path in the blink of an eye, and into the ears of all the itinerant cultivators on the fourth level, making them feel like they were looking up to a great mountain. It was as if this person did not even need to do anything, and only needed to turn his eyes slightly to be able to completely erase all of them. This strong feeling was not illusory at all, and it made them feel a chill from the bottom of their hearts at this moment. However, what was different from before was that this chill did not bring them fear. It brought them a sense of security. This figure was none other than Luo Fan. In the past, Luo Fan's strength would only make them feel that they were so insignificant in front of him. They felt that if they encountered him, they wouldn't be able to resist at all and would definitely be completely destroyed in the first place. But now, as the person they were asking for help, the more powerful Luo Fan was, the more confident they would be in winning against the threat of the gray smoke. Naturally, they felt more secure. However, at this moment, Luo Fan did not care about how these rogue cultivators felt. At this time, he just cast his eyes on the gray smoke that was constantly wreaking havoc on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. With his knowledge, he naturally discovered that the gray smoke was actually the same kind of existence as the universe of negative emotions. It was even to the extent that he could be said to be the initial form of the universe of negative emotions. As long as the corresponding cultivation was carried out and the gray smoke absorbed the corresponding negative emotions in the process of growing, it would naturally evolve into a universe of negative emotions that was parallel to the state of chaos and a layer of the state of chaos. Of course, if it was placed on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path, it would grow into a universe of negative emotions parallel to the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. Once this universe of negative emotions was formed, all living beings on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path might be swallowed by it at any time and thrown into that universe. In fact, it might even completely replace the Genesis energy in the 4th level, causing all the cultivators who entered the 4th level to be thrown into the universe at the first possible moment. They would sink into the countless negative emotions, never to be reincarnated, forever sinking into oblivion. Perhaps this is not bad. Using the universe of negative emotions as a place for cultivation and replacing the structure of the creation power with the structure of the universe of negative emotions seems to be a good choice. Luo Fan thought for a while and suddenly felt that such a change was somewhat inexplicable. After all, although the universe of negative emotions was an extremely harsh environment for living beings, and living beings who were thrown into it would fall into extremely miserable torture. However, it did not mean that they could not cultivate. Perhaps because of such a harsh environment, it could instead allow cultivators to comprehend the various mysteries needed for cultivation faster and more quickly. In this way, it seemed that it was not unacceptable for cultivators to cultivate and improve in such an environment. Anyway, as long as they raised to a certain level and completed a certain requirement, they would naturally be able to ascend to the 5th level and directly escape from this eternal environment of never being reincarnated and forever sinking. In contrast, compared to the situation where the creation power permeated the entire 4th level, there seemed to be no essential difference. At most, there was only a slight difference in the performance of the situation. Perhaps, at that time, the entire Tao Master's path will undergo some kind of adjustment. In this case, it seems that I can try to change the Tao Master's path and achieve the achievements that those under the Tao Master's path have achieved in the previous levels. Such thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. An increasingly strong impulse brewed in his heart and gradually emerged. However, in the end, after a while, he finally suppressed this impulse. The speculation that he had just had was completely based on an illusion. Whether this speculation could really be realized, whether the universe of negative emotions could really replace the structure of the creation power, all of this was still just a fantasy to him. Under such circumstances, all of his efforts might end up in vain. The universe of negative emotions might not be able to replace the structure of the creation power at all. Naturally, it did not matter to him if this kind of effort turned into a bubble. He would not feel that it was a big blow, nor would he feel that such a loss was serious. However, one should not forget that in order to cultivate this wisp of gray smoke into a universe of negative emotions, there was a prerequisite. In order to cultivate this gray smoke into a universe of negative emotions, the gray smoke needed to grow tremendously. It needed to be filled with all the cultivators and all the world clusters that currently existed in the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Except for him. Even if this step was achieved, it was unlikely that the result would be achieved immediately. He still needed to wait here, wait for several times more cultivators to ascend and enter the fourth level, then there would be a trace of a possibility of truly cultivating it into a universe of negative emotions. With such a huge sacrifice, even Luo Fan would not easily make such a decision. In particular, in a situation where the ultimate goal was still unclear and he had no confidence in whether his expectations could be achieved, it was even more impossible for him to make such a sacrifice. After suppressing this impulse, he sighed and his figure shook. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed the barrier of the endless creation power and directly arrived in front of the gray smoke. He floated in front of it, and in the next moment, the gray smoke would completely drown and devour him. At this moment, the gray smoke had already gained a lot of instincts. Facing Luo Fan, it took action in an instant. It did not pounce forward and devour Luo Fan, but dodged. The gray smoke turned and directly turned in another direction, quickly moving away from Luo Fan. It was as if it had turned into a weak rabbit and was facing a ferocious tiger that had just walked out of the forest. Compared to the crazy, domineering, and reckless behavior it had displayed before the crowd of rogue cultivators, there was a world of difference between this and the past. Seeing this scene, even if the rogue cultivators already knew how terrifying Luo Fan was, even if they were sure that Luo Fan was their savior, they could not help but be dumbfounded and could not believe what they saw. Was this the terrifying smoke that forced them to give up their dignity and ask for help? Why did it look like a weak smoke that could be blown away by the wind? Want to leave? Luo Fan frowned slightly at this moment and said. With that, he waved his hand, and a ray of light instantly shot out from his hand. In a flash, it had already surpassed the power of creation, and it directly enveloped the entire gray smoke, causing it to be completely enveloped by the light. At the moment the light emerged, all the rogue cultivators on the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path could not help but exclaim. This was not because they were shocked by Luo Fan's means. Rather, they did not expect this light to be so powerful. At this moment, their eyes and senses, which were closely watching Luo Fan's actions, were all stung by this light. In fact, many rogue cultivators even felt that their souls were filled with this light. Even their souls were constantly being burned by this light, and they felt a constant stinging pain that was getting more and more intense and terrifying. Fortunately, they quickly closed their eyes and withdrew their senses. The light that entered their souls was like water without a source, a tree without roots. As they fought back with all their might, the light's influence on them began to weaken. Although it did not immediately disappear, it was finally showing signs of doing so. Luo Fan naturally did not care about all of this. At this moment, he only manipulated the light of heaven and earth that he had worked hard to cultivate to envelop the gray smoke. The light of heaven and earth had reincarnated and grown in the world cluster time and time again, and had long grown to a certain bottleneck. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth had reached an indescribable peak. It was so powerful that it had far surpassed what Senior Sister May, the middle-aged man, and even the waxen middle-aged man could produce back then. However, the most important thing about the light of heaven and earth, which was the will of heaven and earth, was still not fully formed. At this moment, the terrifying light of heaven and earth contained only a spiritual aura at the level of the will of heaven and earth. Although this spiritual aura was already extremely powerful and had reached the peak that a spiritual aura could reach, and was only a step away from becoming the true will of heaven and earth, it was still a spiritual aura after all, and had not reached the level of the will of heaven and earth. It seemed that there was still an invisible and untouchable gap between the spiritual aura and the will of heaven and earth. However, no matter how far the spiritual aura was from the will of heaven and earth, the power of the light of heaven and earth was not reduced at all. At this moment, the gray mist that could devour the world cluster was as weak as ordinary mist in the face of the light of heaven and earth. Even though it had controlled the power absorbed from thousands of worlds, and even though it had controlled the power of thousands of independent cultivators to struggle, it was still so insignificant in the face of the light of heaven and earth. The light of heaven and earth did not even need to gather any power. Just its existence alone was enough to suppress the gray mist, and the gray mist could not even make the light of heaven and earth tremble. With a thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and clenched his fist, and the light of heaven and earth began to slowly shrink. The gray mist that was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth began to shrink at the same rhythm as the light of heaven and earth suppressed it. Not long after, when Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth gathered into a sphere with a diameter of 3 meters, the gray mist had also shrunk into a small, thumb-sized, pitch-black stone within the sphere. It's absorbed enough power indeed. Luo Fan sighed as he looked at the stone. He raised his hand and reached into the light that was formed by the light of heaven and earth, which was billions of times more dazzling than the sun. He completely ignored the power that the light had that could suppress everything, and reached the deepest part of it with ease, grabbing the thumb-sized, pitch-black stone. The stone felt extremely cold to touch, as if it was the coldest thing in the chaos. Even if it was Luo Fan, the moment he touched this stone, the feeling of his fingers being frozen emerged from the bottom of his heart. Fortunately, he was within the range of the light of heaven and earth after all. Hence, even though it was so cold, he only needed a thought to use the power of the light of heaven and earth to completely dispel it, allowing his body and mind to be completely isolated from the stone's power. With a thought, the incomparably dazzling light of heaven and earth began to slowly retract. In the end, only a thin layer was left, covering the stone. The rest of the light returned to his body, in a state where it seemed to exist but not exist. Although it was only a thin layer of light of heaven and earth, its light was still extremely dazzling. None of the independent cultivators could see what exactly the stone that was enveloped by the light looked like. In other words, there was no way to see what the gray smoke looked like inside. Chapter 2254. To the light of heaven and earth, only the power that it possessed and the complete will of the universe could be considered complete. Once it was complete, the light of heaven and earth would naturally be able to transform into anything. It could be big or small, strong or weak, visible or hidden. It was almost omnipotent and omnipotent. As long as any one of them was missing, there would naturally be a huge deficiency in terms of function. Just like the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan had condensed, the power of the light of heaven and earth had already reached an unimaginable level. However, because the will of the universe that it possessed had yet to take form, and was still at the stage of spirituality, the light itself could not transform endlessly and be omnipotent like the real light of heaven and earth. The fact that the light could be visible but not hidden was a manifestation of this deficiency. If the light of heaven and earth's will had already reached the level of the universe's will, with a single thought from Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth would naturally retract its light, and even turn into a strange state that was almost like a material object that did not emit any light at all. However, due to the lack of this most crucial transformation, he could not do this at all. He could only allow the light to be in a state where it was at full power and maintain this extremely dazzling state at all times. Apart from him, no other rogue cultivators could see the essence of the light, nor could they see the essence of the stone that was condensed from the gray smoke that was concealed by the thin layer of light. He raised his hand to grab the stone, and instantly sensed the various characteristics of the stone. It can already be considered an emotional spacetime. At this moment, he made a judgment about the essence of the stone. after being forcefully compressed by the light of heaven and earth, the gray smoke's essence had already undergone some sort of sublimation. It was originally a product derived from a mixture of a wisp of positive and negative emotions, but it had transformed into a state between the emotional universe and the substance of the smoke. This state could be called the emotional spacetime state. This emotional spacetime had an infinite space within it, and even had its own unique river of time. If ordinary living beings were to enter it, they would feel as if they had entered any other universe or any other world. They would feel as if they had stepped into a whole new world, and they would not notice that it was just a small stone. They wouldn't be able to tell that it was nothing more than the product of a certain combination of emotions. At this time, the proportion of emotions in the emotional spacetime was already dominated by negative emotions, causing the entire emotional spacetime to lean towards the negative emotional spacetime. Such an existence was naturally nothing to Luo Fan, but it could be regarded as a dangerous place for ordinary independent cultivators. Just like the tens of thousands of itinerant cultivators that existed in this place at this moment. To them, the emotional spacetime was like a hell that had been created for them. Everything they encountered at every moment was what they didn't want to see the most, what they rejected the most, and what they wanted to get away from the most. A rogue cultivator who felt guilty about a certain matter would see that matter constantly replaying itself in front of him. He could even see that matter constantly developing, constantly magnifying, and finally engulfing him. Those rogue cultivators who had encountered some sort of regret would also find that the regret kept flashing in front of them. Every time it happened, it would be as exciting and uncomfortable as the first time they experienced it, and so on and so forth, causing all the rogue cultivators to suffer unbearable torment at every moment. And the negative emotions produced by this torment would, in turn, fuse back into the emotional spacetime, causing the emotional spacetime to evolve further into a negative emotional spacetime. As a result, the many rogue cultivators' encounters became more and more tragic, and their torment became more and more intense. In this way, it formed a vicious cycle. However, this was much better than the state they were in when they were directly engulfed by the gray smoke. When they were engulfed by the gray smoke, their willpower had actually been completely suppressed. They had completely turned into walking corpses. They were only being controlled by the gray smoke, and they were doing everything that the gray smoke needed them to do. Although it was painful, and although every moment was the most intense torment, they still recovered their willpower and broke away from the state of walking corpses. Of course, there might be some rogue cultivators who felt that they would rather be in the state of walking corpses than endure this torment. At this moment, in the outside world, many rogue cultivators who had not been affected by the gray smoke had become excited. Even though they didn't know what the gray smoke had become, and even though their eyes were stinging and their souls were being crushed by the afterimages left in their hearts by the light of heaven and earth, the gray smoke's threat to them had finally disappeared. Even if they did not know how the powerhouse would treat them, at least they would not be completely engulfed by the gray smoke. They would live a life worse than death, and would never be able to reincarnate. No matter how they looked at it, this situation was worthy of their excitement and celebration. At this moment, one of the rogue cultivators sent a voice transmission to Luo Fan. "Thank you for your help, Senior. We are extremely grateful." The other rogue cultivators also returned to their senses at this moment. They forcefully suppressed their various negative states and sent voice transmissions to Luo Fan, thanking Luo Fan for saving them from their predicament. Each of their gratitude was more sincere than the last, and each of them was more mushy than the last. They could not wait to make Luo Fan feel embarrassed to deal with them. At this moment, each of them was in great pain. Each of them had endured unbearable torment during the process, and all of them could not wait to find a place to meditate in seclusion. However, none of them dared to express their gratitude to Luo Fan at this moment. None of them dared to show even the slightest bit of insincerity at this moment. There was no other reason than that one of the rogue cultivators had already expressed his gratitude with incomparable sincerity. Comparisons were the worst. If it wasn't for the rogue cultivator's actions, they wouldn't have expressed their gratitude. Naturally, it wouldn't have been too abrupt, and that expert might not have noticed them. However, if a rogue cultivator started to express his gratitude but they did not take any action, then they would naturally stand out and be noticed by the powerhouse. At that time, if that powerhouse was displeased and directly attacked him, then he would die an unjust death. This kind of worry seemed to be groundless, as if they were worrying too much. However, how could they not think about it when it concerned their own lives? Luo Fan was attracted by so many rogue cultivators. He turned his head and glanced at them. Suddenly, he smiled faintly and said, "There's no need to thank me. Just take it as compensation for what will happen next." Hearing this, the rogue cultivators could not help but feel a sense of foreboding. At this moment, Luo Fan waved his hand, and the light of heaven and earth that had originally covered the emotional spacetime was suddenly released. In an instant, it swept across the entire fourth level of the Road of Tao Master, covering all the rogue cultivators and all the worlds that existed in the fourth level. It was so thin that it was almost insignificant. If one did not pay close attention, they would have overlooked it at a glance. Only then did the rogue cultivators come to their senses. They were all horrified and shouted, "Senior, what do you mean by this?" Even as they yelled, they did their best to stimulate their world cluster, gathering the power that belonged to their world cluster that they gradually came to understand and charge towards the radiance that engulfed their world cluster and their bodies, doing all they could to tear it apart and regain their freedom. While they did not know what that radiance was, the gray smoke that had left them in despair was as weak as normal smoke, and yet it remained in their memories. Therefore, there was no need to explain how frightening the power of that radiance was. Now that such a light had covered their world group, how could they not panic? Unfortunately, although the light was only a trace of the light that Luo Fan had extracted from the light of heaven and earth, its level had already surpassed the fourth level of the Road of Tao Master and the power that had been abstracted from the world group that existed in the fourth level. Therefore, no matter how the rogue cultivators struggled and attacked, they still could not affect the light in the slightest. During the process, the light seemed to be on a different level from the world group. No matter how the power attacked, it did not waver or change in the slightest. In the face of such a situation, the rogue cultivators finally lost all hope and roared in shock and anger. In between these roars of shock and anger, there were even crying, begging for mercy, and surrendering. Even though they were experts who had already passed the four tribulations, their performance in the face of a fatal crisis was not much different from that of ordinary people, except for the way they behaved. Naturally, Luo Fan did not care about all this. At this time, he just manipulated the light of heaven and earth to pull these world groups towards the vortex in the center, where his world group was located. For ordinary rogue cultivators, it was naturally an extremely difficult thing to pull and move their own world group. However, for Luo Fan, who had condensed the light of heaven and earth, it was just a matter of whether he wanted to or not. Therefore, from the perspective of the entire fourth level of the Road of Tao Master, the countless world groups in the entire fourth level seemed to be attracted by the smoke vortex in the center and began to revolve around it, gradually approaching the vortex. After an unknown period of time, the world groups began to be thrown into the vortex, and then they continued to go deeper into the vortex through the orbit of the vortex, and finally, they were glued to the world groups that were originally glued to Luo Fan's world group. As the Cosmos group was glued to it, the wills of the rogue cultivators were naturally captured by Luo Fan's Cosmos group. They were thrown into the Cosmos group and entered a random world, a time-space reincarnation cycle. At the moment when the wills of the rogue cultivators were about to be thrown into the reincarnation, the despair in their hearts suddenly skyrocketed. Although it was only for a moment, The despair produced in this moment was equivalent to the despair that could only be produced after millions of years. This kind of despair, through some unimaginable channel that even Luo Fan could not understand, was directly transmitted to the small emotional spacetime that was still in Luo Fan's hand at this moment, which was covered by the light of heaven and earth, and could not be seen by all the other rogue cultivators. It directly integrated into the emotional spacetime, causing the spacetime to tremble and suddenly expand a little in this way. The moment the will of every rogue cultivator was thrown into the reincarnation of a certain world or a certain space, this situation would occur once. In the beginning, Luo Fan naturally did not notice this change. After all, this change was completely out of his expectations. However, as the number of times increased, as the frequency of this situation increased, no matter how slow he should have gradually discovered this situation. Moreover, the word slow didn't have anything to do with him in the first place. There's actually such a change? He murmured. His eyes flickered, and he directly locked onto the small emotional spacetime in his hand. With the help of the light of heaven and earth, he sensed all the slightest changes that occurred in it. At this moment, the spacetime was already several times larger than at the beginning. The originally imperfect laws and principles had also become much more complete. Behind these laws, there was also a strange great Tao that was gradually taking shape. Evidently, this spacetime was already turning into a universe of emotions, and a universe of negative emotions had begun to change. This change caused the stone to become much heavier at this moment. Moreover, the light of heaven and earth could also feel the increasingly powerful pressure coming from it. This pressure caused the ball of light in his hand to tremble slightly, and he had no choice but to gather more light of heaven and earth in his hand to wrap around this emotional spacetime. This also caused the sun in his hand to become larger and more dazzling. I originally planned to give up, but it seems like there's still a possibility of success now. At this moment, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind, and an indescribable excitement appeared in his eyes. Chapter 2255. As Luo Fan changed the way he collected the wills of the itinerant cultivators, the negative emotions that were born from them began to increase continuously. The emotional spacetime that was gradually transforming into a universe of negative emotions began to grow at an unimaginable speed. The blood-red smoke at the beginning was formed by the accumulation of regret, guilt, anger, and other negative emotions of the itinerant cultivators. From this, it could be seen how mysterious and powerful the negative emotions of the itinerant cultivators were. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan consciously enhanced their negative emotions, and the impact it caused was naturally far beyond the limits of ordinary people's imagination. As the negative emotional spacetime continued to expand, the amount of heaven and earth light that Luo Fan attached to it naturally increased. From afar, it seemed like a sun that was getting bigger, brighter, and more dazzling gradually appeared where Luo Fan was. It was a sun that gradually covered him completely, making it difficult to see him beyond a certain distance. The emotional spacetime affected all wills, not only the wills of living beings, but also the wills of heaven and earth. If there was no influence, the predecessor of the emotional spacetime would not have been able to devour the countless worlds, and spacetime in those worlds. The reason why Luo Fan was not affected by the emotional spacetime at this moment was that his heaven and earth light isolated the emotional spacetime from him. It seemed like he was directly supporting the emotional spacetime, but in fact there was a huge gap between the two of them, isolating them from each other. Compared to Luo Fan, who could stay away from the emotional spacetime under the isolation of the heaven and earth light, the heaven and earth light obviously did not have such a good thing. At this moment, it directly came into contact with the emotional spacetime, and the spiritual aura that belonged to the will of heaven and earth was constantly affected by the emotional spacetime. The reason why it did not show any abnormalities and did not cause any changes to the heaven and earth light was that although the spiritual aura was not the true will of heaven and earth, Its quantity had reached an unbelievable level. With the influence of the emotional spacetime, it would take an extremely long time to accumulate the influence on the spiritual aura to the point where living beings could sense it. However, this was only the beginning. But now, the emotional spacetime was growing continuously. In the emotional spacetime, things that didn't exist in the emotional spacetime, such as the nomological rules, great Tao, and even the will of heaven and earth that belonged to the emotional spacetime. In this way, the emotional spacetime's influence on the spiritual aura of the worlds will begin to strengthen at an unimaginable speed. Faintly, one could see bits and pieces of faint, gray luster gradually appearing in the light of the world. However, this luster was extremely dim. Under the stimulation of the light of heaven and earth, it quickly disappeared. Even Luo Fan couldn't detect its existence. At this moment, Luo Fan only focused his attention on the emotional spacetime. He carefully sensed every tiny change that was produced in the emotional spacetime. He sensed the process of the countless nomological rules being born little by little. He sensed every detail of the infinite nomological rules being formed little by little. He also sensed every tiny change in the great Tao that appeared from nothingness during this process. He felt that his understanding of the emotional spacetime was deepening at every moment. He discovered that his sensitivity to emotions was strengthening at every moment. In a trance, he seemed to have become the ruler of the emotional spacetime. He was dominating all the changes in the entire emotional spacetime and manipulating the formation of the emotional spacetime. In a trance, he even felt that his worldview of laws had resurfaced from the depths of his memory. Countless concepts and cognition began to be reflected in the emotional spacetime. He began to comprehend the changes in the emotional spacetime through his worldview of laws. Through the changes in the emotional spacetime, he began to recomprehend the various concepts and cognition in his worldview, as well as the various concepts and abilities that were derived from them. In this transformation, he gradually forgot the passage of time. His entire person seemed to have turned into a comprehending machine. He just blindly repeated the process that he had set up at the beginning. He slowly inserted the will of a rogue cultivator into his own world cluster. At the same time, he constantly comprehended the countless negative emotions that seeped into the emotional spacetime, stimulating the emotional spacetime to produce all kinds of subtle changes and all kinds of indescribable growth. This process caused his view of the world to undergo an extremely subtle and even imperceptible change at every moment. Or perhaps it could be said that he was growing. His life origin also underwent all kinds of subtle changes during this process. It seemed to become more and more exquisite. The bright spots on it became brighter and brighter. The absolute aura that was revealed from the bright spots became more and more obvious. In contrast, the light of heaven and earth that he emitted that covered the emotional spacetime was also constantly strengthening. The light looked brighter and brighter. It was getting hotter and hotter. And in a place that Luo Fan did not notice, where the light of heaven and earth came into contact with the emotional spacetime, there were layers of gray constantly appearing and disappearing again. Just like that, time continued to flow, and before he knew it, 10 million years had passed. No matter how slow Luo Fan's speed was, 10 million years was enough for him to put all the will of the rogue cultivators into his own world cluster. He also moved all the worlds of the rogue cultivators into the whirlpool, where his world cluster was located through various means and directly glued together with his world cluster. It could be said that compared to the original appearance of countless tiny stars around the whirlpool, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path had become extremely empty, and there were no more stars. In addition to the central whirlpool, there was only one existence outside the whirlpool. It was a sun that emitted infinite light and illuminated the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. It was a sun that no one knew how big it was, but any rogue cultivator who looked at it would feel their eyes burning and feel the shadow of a sun that would never disappear in their hearts. As for what was inside the sun, what was beside the sun, and what kind of substance existed, even if Luo Fan was standing outside, he could no longer see clearly. When the last rogue cultivator was thrown in, the process that was originally set by Luo Fan, which was constantly repeating itself, was instantly interrupted. Luo Fan, who had been immersed in the evolution of the emotional spacetime, was forcibly pulled out of his immersion at this moment. Is it over? Such a thought flashed in his mind when he came back to his senses. He swept his perception around, and all the changes in the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path were already completely within his perception. It's a pity that there are no more rogue cultivators. Looking at the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, which only had the creation power left, he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. In the past 10 million years, the benefits he had gained were so great that he had not expected it to be. The negative emotion universe could occupy a place in the state of chaos, and even the state of chaos could not be shaken. It needed to be divided into a level to accommodate it. Even the emotional spacetime that was born in the fourth level of the Tao Master's path was not a negative emotion universe that could really exist in the state of chaos. It was definitely not comparable to an ordinary spacetime, an ordinary world, or an ordinary universe. It could be said that the negative emotion spacetime in front of Luo Fan was not inferior to the big world from a certain point of view. And such an existence had been in his hands for the past 10 million years. It had always been in front of him, allowing him to sense all the changes that existed in it. He had understood all the details that existed in it, and all the fundamental principles of evolution. It was easy to imagine the impact it had on him. It could be said that today, his worldview had made great progress compared to tens of millions of years ago. The result of this was that the power of his divine ability had skyrocketed by at least several times compared to before, but in his eyes, this was just a minor improvement. What he really cared about was that, in the process, his understanding of the light of heaven and earth had been further deepened. This deepening made him vaguely understand how his light of heaven and earth could grow from the original spiritual aura to the will of heaven and earth. All kinds of thoughts flashed in his mind, and he suddenly smiled bitterly. The pity in his eyes had disappeared, and was replaced by an indescribable joy. But I took it for granted at the beginning. Maybe I should be glad that there are not enough rogue cultivators in the fourth level. He thought in his heart, and the joy on his face became even stronger. However, through the various digesting and recollections just now, he already knew the mistake he had made back then. In other words, he understood what kind of changes had happened to the light of heaven and earth, which he used to resist the emotional spacetime, or rather, the emotional spacetime that was transforming into a universe of negative emotions. With a slight thought, he carefully sensed his light of heaven and earth, comprehending all the subtle and mysterious aura that the light of heaven and earth exuded, searching for the various subtle pulses within it. At this moment, an incomparably powerful spiritual aura rushed towards him, directly drowning his mind and completely drowning out his previous senses. At first glance, this spiritual aura was no different from 10 million years ago. However, Luo Fan, who already had his own understanding, quickly discovered the changes compared to 10 million years ago. There were many more feelings that he could understand in this spiritual aura. It was a feeling that belonged to a living being. This feeling of belonging to a living being made him feel closer to this spiritual aura, and they seemed to be more compatible. However, he was very clear that this kind of closeness and compatibility was not a good thing. This was because he, as a living being, felt a sense of closeness and compatibility with the living being contained within the spiritual aura, but it did not mean that his relationship with this spiritual aura had become closer and more compatible. In fact, The additional feeling of belonging to a living being in this spiritual aura was an impurity that the spiritual aura should have avoided the most. Once the feeling of the living being contaminated by this spiritual aura was strengthened to a certain extent, this spiritual aura would naturally contaminate the part of the spiritual aura that belonged to the world's will. This would undoubtedly make it much easier for the spiritual aura to grow into a will. However, it would make the quality of the will that he ultimately obtained much worse. It could be imagined that if this change was allowed to continue, when this spiritual aura grew into a will in the future, it would at most be similar to the will of the world that Senior Sister May, the middle-aged cultivator, and the waxen middle-aged man had back then. Just the thought of this situation was enough to make Luo Fan's hair stand on end. It must be known that the light of heaven and earth that Senior Sister May and the others had faced back then could be easily dealt with by him, even if it had just condensed a little bit of spiritual aura. If his light of heaven and earth was able to deal with the level of light of heaven and earth that he had just condensed, it would simply be a mockery of the huge price that he had paid for so many years. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that Luo Fan would feel so fortunate at this moment. The reason why he could wake up at this moment instead of waiting for the light of heaven and earth to reach a point where it could not be salvaged was because the lone cultivator was already gone. In other words, it was precisely because his original continuous cycle had been interrupted at this instant. Fortunately, it seems that if there is a will of the heavens, it is still on my side. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he could not help but look up at the sky. At the very least, it was the sky from his current angle. Chapter 2256. Naturally, Luo Fan would not allow the speculation of the so-called heavenly will to linger in his mind for too long. In fact, he would not even allow it to linger in his mind. After all, for him, who was determined to break through all shackles and transcend everything, admitting the existence of the heavenly will would be a blasphemy to all his efforts. Perhaps he would occasionally speculate about the existence of the heavenly will, but he would never really believe that there was a heavenly will that was controlling everything about him. Even if this so-called will of the heavens might really exist, at this moment, after erasing the thoughts about the heavenly will, he began to focus his mind on the light of heaven and earth. He began to carefully sense the slightest changes within the light of heaven and earth, searching for the source that made the light of heaven and earth less pure and made the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth feel like it belonged to a living being. As he carefully searched, he soon discovered that the location of the existence that he deeply hated was none other than the negative emotional spacetime that was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth. Even though he had stopped causing the many unaffiliated cultivators to produce negative emotions, the emotional spacetime was still continuously producing various effects that were transmitted into the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, Luo Fan finally saw the changes that the light of heaven and earth was producing under the influence of the negative emotional spacetime. A portion of the light of heaven and earth was constantly being stained gray, and was quickly expelled by the light of heaven and earth. In his senses, the feeling of a living being appeared from the light of heaven and earth that was being stained gray but quickly recovered. It then spread to the entire light of heaven and earth, and then to the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth. The reason why there was such a change was because the light of heaven and earth naturally contained a bit of the aura of the light of heaven and earth during the change. The remnant of the light of heaven and earth was because the power of the light of heaven and earth was not completely expelled after it spread out. What was the power of the light of heaven and earth? Although the light of heaven and earth was formed by the combination of the emotions of countless living beings and the power of creation, it was still formed after all sorts of mysterious and wonderful changes. However, its foundation was ultimately the various emotions of countless living beings. Even after countless changes, countless cover-ups, and countless distortions, this essence still remained the same. Under such circumstances, the essence of the power that seeped out from the emotional spacetime and even affected the light of heaven and earth naturally belonged to emotions. Such emotions were what the light of heaven and earth lacked the most at the moment. Perhaps that was not the final key to the evolution of the spiritual aura within the light of heaven and earth, but it was definitely an existence that could only be possessed after the spiritual aura had completely transformed into the will of the world. Under such circumstances, it was imaginable how much the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth desired the emotional essence contained in the power that seeped out of the emotional spacetime. For this spiritual aura that had yet to find any direction, breakthrough, or metamorphosis, how could it not regard this emotion that could only be born after its metamorphosis as the key to its metamorphosis? Therefore, after the power of the emotional spacetime seeped into the light of heaven and earth, the light of heaven and earth completely crushed and expelled the other powers. However, it naturally devoured the various emotions contained within and integrated them into the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth. In this way, as time passed and the number of times the power was contaminated increased, the amount of emotions within the emotional spacetime that was fused with the spiritual aura naturally increased. Fortunately, the spiritual aura's essence was extremely high, and it was completely condensed according to the state of the will of the world. Compared to the will of the living beings, it was many times stronger. In the end, the emotions that seeped out of the countless emotional spacetime could not produce an immediate effect on the contamination of the spiritual aura. It could not really make the spiritual aura directly fall from the original state of the will of the world to the level of the will of ordinary living beings. Even after tens of millions of years, it only made the spiritual aura feel like a living being. As for whether the emotion itself was negative or positive, it was not reflected in the spiritual aura. After all, positive and negative were concepts at the level of living beings. Such concepts were meaningless to the will of the world, unless the positive or negative emotion could be upgraded to the level of the will of the world. However, it was obvious that the positive or negative emotions contained in the emotional spacetime had not been upgraded to the level of the will of the world. That was why the current situation had occurred. After discovering the source of the change, Luo Fan had already decided what to do. I can only destroy it. He sighed to himself and looked at the emotional spacetime lying in the depths of the light of heaven and earth with some pity. The power of the emotional spacetime was quite terrifying. It was almost fatal to all the rogue cultivators and even all the disciples of the Tao Master on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. If they were thrown into it, it could be said that it was equivalent to falling into oblivion forever. He could even predict that the negative emotional spacetime would inevitably have a strong effect on the fifth or sixth level and would be of great help to him. Once the emotional spacetime was sublimated and transformed into the emotional universe, its power might be even more amazing. In the end, it would be able to work on stronger existences and even bring great benefits to his cultivation. It would allow him to comprehend more of the mysteries of the universe and even use this change to understand some of the mysteries of the chaotic state. However, all of this had to be based on the emotional spacetime not affecting his own safety. If this emotional spacetime could affect his safety, and even affect his cultivation and his way of cultivation, then no matter how precious it was and how beneficial it was to him, he would never keep it by his side. To him, the light of heaven and earth was not just a divine ability or a method, but a way to comprehend the will of heaven and earth. It was a way to improve his willpower, to improve his cultivation path, and to improve his understanding of the world of laws. Under such circumstances, if the light of heaven and earth was affected, it meant that everything about him was affected, which was naturally unacceptable to him. Therefore, it was almost inevitable for him to destroy the emotional spacetime. After making the decision, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and the light of heaven and earth began to change. its original state of constantly releasing light in all directions and even turning it into an extremely dazzling sun that covered everything began to change rapidly. All the light began to converge, and the originally extremely dazzling appearance began to fade rapidly. Everything that was covered by the dazzling light, including Luo Fan who was holding the light and the stone formed by the emotional spacetime that existed within the light, was also revealed during this process. On the other hand, within the light, the world's light that was attached to the emotional spacetime began to undergo all sorts of indescribable changes. Countless worlds, and spacetimes were formed out of thin air and began to collide with the emotional spacetime, causing it to constantly tremble. When these worlds, and spacetime first appeared, they could not have much of an impact on the emotional spacetime. Even if they collided with it and caused it to tremble continuously, it only stopped trembling. The emotional spacetime was still the same as before. However, as time passed, as the number of worlds, and spacetime derived from the light of heaven and earth increased, and as the number of collisions increased, the emotional spacetime was affected more and more. After millions of times, the outer layer of the emotional spacetime began to disintegrate bit by bit in every collision between heaven and earth, world, and spacetime, and its internal structure became more and more chaotic in the process. It was as if the power of those worlds, and spacetime could penetrate into the emotional spacetime. In the face of this situation, after tens of millions of years of evolution, the emotional spacetime, which was completely different from what it used to be and was only one last transformation away from the emotional universe, also produced various mysterious and complicated changes. It gave birth to all kinds of incredible power, unimaginable light and shadow, and even condensed into countless creatures that were constantly emerging from the emotional spacetime from all directions. They rushed to the boundary of the emotional spacetime and rushed into the worlds, and spacetime that collided with the emotional spacetime, to strangle everything, destroy everything, and resist everything. The change of the light of heaven and earth was very simple. Under the will of Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth manipulated the light of heaven and earth with its aura of spirituality that was close to the will of heaven and earth to specifically evolve the emotional spacetime. It produced a world, and a spacetime that completely targeted the emotional spacetime to collide with the emotional spacetime and to strangle the emotional spacetime in the most natural and most targeted way. This change was also the fundamental difference between Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth and that of senior sister Mei and other fifth-level Tao master disciples and rogue cultivators. The will of the light of heaven and earth was itself the will of heaven and earth. Under the control of this will, the light of heaven and earth should be able to evolve according to all situations and finally suppress and destroy everything. Whether it was the means of the fifth-level Tao Master or the means of a higher level, the light of heaven and earth would definitely have a way to deal with everything. After all, there are still some effects. Feeling the various changes inside the light of heaven and earth, Luo Fan secretly sighed. The emotional spacetime had been contaminated by the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth for tens of millions of years, and after all, it still affected the light of heaven and earth a lot. If the light of heaven and earth faced the emotional spacetime in the past, it would have taken 10 times less time to evolve its attack to the current stage. In that case, it would have been difficult for the emotional spacetime to react and resist the various targeted means that the light of heaven and earth had evolved. Perhaps, the light of heaven and earth had already completely destroyed the emotional spacetime. However, fortunately, he discovered it early. In this natural evolution, the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth instinctively discovered the various impurities that affected its improvement, slowed down its growth, and even destroyed the evolution of its power. Finally, in the process of constantly displaying its power and evolving means, it took the initiative to drive out the emotions of the living beings that had been contaminated by the emotional spacetime for tens of millions of years. This was like an ordinary person thinking that wearing a heavy armor as heavy as a tank on the battlefield would be of great help to his killing and escape. He even thought that he could become a tank because of this and be invincible. However, once he was on the battlefield, he would realize that his arrogance was completely wrong. This kind of armor not only hindered him from killing, but it also hindered him from escaping. At that time, he would take off the heavy, tank-like armor and naturally take the initiative to return to a relaxed state. The light of heaven and earth was like that ordinary person. Before it started fighting with the emotional spacetime, it thought that the emotions that had been contaminated by the emotional spacetime would be of great benefit to its sublimation, metamorphosis, and evolution. Therefore, it was eager to pull all the emotions from the emotional spacetime over and fuse them into itself. However, when it really faced the emotional spacetime and used its strongest means to attack the emotional spacetime, it realized that these emotions were a huge burden to it. The more these emotions there were, the weaker its strength would be. With such willpower, it would naturally get rid of these emotions instinctively. As for the difficulty of getting rid of these emotions, it was needless to say. As the will of a living being, it was naturally difficult to get rid of the emotions in the spiritual aura that was close to the will of the world for Luo Fan. However, for the spiritual aura, getting rid of these emotions was as obvious as taking off one's clothes. How difficult was it at all? After all, the spiritual aura was an existence that could target all the powerhouses from the 5th level. How difficult was it to derive some means to get rid of these emotions? Chapter 2257. Luo Fan was not surprised by the Light of Universe's spiritual aura's choice. After all, before encountering an unsolvable problem, any consciousness would naturally be confident in its own judgment. It was the same for this spiritual aura. Before it was completely convinced that all these emotions would only have negative effects on its performance, it naturally wouldn't overturn its original conclusion so easily. However, it was obvious that this would happen sooner or later. The emotions that came from the emotional spacetime were indeed a burden and poison to the spiritual aura. As long as it continued to fight against the emotional spacetime, it would discover this sooner or later. Therefore, it was only temporarily reluctant to get rid of them. As time passed and the battle progressed, there would come a day when it would truly get rid of all the influence of the emotions. At this moment, in his world group, the consciousness of a rogue cultivator suddenly woke up due to some unknown reason and broke free from the influence of the reincarnation power. At this moment, the cultivation realm of the cultivator that he had reincarnated into began to rise rapidly, and his strength swelled at a crazy rate. In the blink of an eye, he had risen from the false sage stage to the tribulation stage powerhouse. Following this, he changed again and again. Not long after, he had risen from the early tribulation stage to the 4th tribulation stage powerhouse. At this stage, the world he was in was already a shackle for the rogue cultivator. In that instant, the power in his body surged, and the violent power directly broke through the world. Boundless power wreaked havoc in all directions, affecting other worlds, and other spacetime. All of a sudden, the entire world cluster seemed to have fallen into extreme chaos. Even the vortex in the outside world seemed to be shaken in the process, vaguely creating subtle chaos. Luo Fan immediately sensed something. With a thought, his perception directly descended on that world through the connection of the world group and enveloped that rogue cultivator. At this moment, the rogue cultivator had completely recovered his memory and strength, and instantly discovered Luo Fan's perception. At this moment, he was so angry that he wanted to go crazy. His incomparably ferocious power increased crazily, and an incomparably terrifying impact swept out in all directions from where he was. It crazily impacted the endless void around him, the endless heaven and earth, the endless world, the endless spacetime in the void. How dare you play with my memory and my will? Go to hell. An incomparably strong will instantly burst out from his body. It was like a raging flame, burning and contaminating everything. What made you wake up? Luo Fan murmured. With a thought, the power of the world group instantly gathered around the rogue cultivator, completely imprisoning him inside and out. The power of Luo Fan's world group had been enhanced by many rogue cultivators, countless disciples of Tao Masters, and even the middle-aged rogue cultivator from the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, the power stimulated an effect that was similar to the barrier between the levels, and directly confined the various waves, thoughts, power, and power released by the rogue cultivator. Although the rogue cultivator could still sense everything within this power, he felt as if he had turned into an ordinary mortal and was facing a supreme god. He could not even move his body, let alone use his power and magic power. Don't even think about knowing what made me wake up. A powerful will suddenly burst out from the rogue cultivator's body. At this moment, this rogue cultivator actually brazenly detonated his own mind, wanting to completely erase everything he knew, so that Luo Fan would no longer be able to obtain any information from him. It was a pity that everything inside was under Luo Fan's control. Even time and opportunity couldn't escape his control at this moment. The fact that he did not detonate himself before being controlled meant that he no longer had any chance to detonate himself. At this moment, the power of Luo Fan's world group directly seeped into the rogue cultivator's body and directly gathered all the power, and willpower in his body. In the blink of an eye, he felt that his will and memories, which had already been ignited, had instantly stagnated. His memories began to unfold like a scroll, and all the secrets began to emerge in the process. Nothing was left out, and they were all read by the terrifying existence in front of him. There's a power similar to emotions that directly swept away all the fog and woke him up. After investigating the source, Luo Fan finally found the ultimate source. So it's that. At this moment, Luo Fan understood what was going on. It turned out that it was the emotional spacetime. As for the method it used, it was very simple. It was through the indescribable mysterious connection that existed between the emotional spacetime and the living being that it transmitted its own power to the will of the living being. With the power of emotions, it cleared away the fog that had been laid on the mind of the reincarnation of heaven and earth. In the end, the rogue cultivator directly regained his consciousness, and in the process, he took back all the power that had been imprisoned by Luo Fan. I didn't expect it to be like this. Luo Fan frowned at this moment. The rogue cultivator regained his freedom, and it was not a problem for him to take back his power. After all, with his means, he could suppress the rogue cultivator again in a minute, and even put him back into the reincarnation, so that he could once again provide power for the evolution of his heaven and earth, world, and space-time. However, this was only limited to a few people, and even limited to the rogue cultivator himself. If this goal was extended to every individual cultivator, even every disciple of a Tao Master, and even the middle-aged individual cultivator who came from the 5th level of the Tao Master's path could obtain this kind of help to retrieve their memories and strength, they would be able to do so. That would be a rather big problem for him, not to mention, his world group would definitely be seriously damaged, and a large part of his energy would be needed to repair it. His support for the light of heaven and earth would probably weaken. In this way, the resistance of the emotional spacetime towards the light of heaven and earth would probably increase to an unimaginable level. It might even reverse the situation, and destroy his light of heaven and earth. Just as he was thinking about this, there was a sudden roar from all over the world group. Waves of powerful aura broke through the shackles of heaven and earth, world, and spacetime, and directly descended into the void between the world group, destroying the heaven and earth, world, and spacetime where they were. Kill! The roar spread throughout the world group in an instant. At the same time, outside Luo Fan's world group, many spacetimes that were directly or indirectly stuck to his world group and were completely enveloped by the will world above the world group began to change at this moment. It was as if they had suddenly awakened from their slumber, and began to resist the will world that covered them. They began to resist the oneness that connected them to Luo Fan's world group. Obviously, this was because the masters of the world group had gained autonomy and began to mobilize all their power to resist Luo Fan's power. The number of rogue cultivators kept increasing. In the beginning, there were only a few hundred of them, but in the blink of an eye, there were tens of thousands. In the blink of an eye, there were hundreds of thousands of them. Fortunately, it's not all the cultivators, just these rogue cultivators who came later. After sensing for a while, Luo Fan let out a sigh of relief. At the same time, he had an inexplicable guess. These cultivators who were constantly receiving the power of the emotional spacetime and awakening were not all the cultivators who were thrown into his world group to help the world group evolve. Instead, they were the rogue cultivators who were thrown into the world group after the emotional spacetime was formed. In other words, they were the rogue cultivators who were thrown into the world group in the past tens of millions of years. With this, he could not help but make some guesses about how they could obtain the power of the emotional spacetime. It was probably because they had already established a connection with the emotional spacetime, which allowed them to obtain power from the emotional spacetime and help them recover. In other words, it was because the emotional spacetime was born and grew that it absorbed a large amount of positive or negative emotions from them, causing them to unknowingly establish an indescribable mysterious connection with the emotional spacetime. This allowed the emotional spacetime to pour its own power into their bodies and help them clear the fog left in their consciousness by the world group. After thinking of this, his expression relaxed a little. After knowing the source, he already had many ideas to cut off this connection. With a slight thought, he continuously transmitted his thoughts into the light of heaven and earth. As his thoughts were transmitted, the light of heaven and earth began to surge naturally. Layers of strange barriers instantly formed on the surface of the light of heaven and earth. They constantly rotated and changed. The frequency of the changes was so fast that it had even surpassed Luo Fan's perception. Even if it was him, he could only see that the barrier was constantly rotating, constantly changing, and constantly changing into all kinds of special forms that were either common or rare. However, he could not distinguish how many changes there were on the barrier in an instant. This performance allowed Luo Fan to instantly calculate how many changes there were on the barrier in an instant. With his ability to distinguish, it would take at least hundreds of trillions of changes for him to not be able to distinguish them. In other words, the countless layers of the barrier that enveloped the light of heaven and earth were going through hundreds of trillions of changes in an instant. During these changes, the barrier's impact on the connection that he wanted to intercept had not yet appeared. However, the effect it had on the light of heaven and earth itself was already evident. As the barrier's changes appeared, the spiritual aura of the light of heaven and earth that belonged to a living being began to disappear at an unimaginable speed. Judging from the speed at which it was disappearing, it was at least 10 times faster than before. It was obvious that the spiritual aura finally understood more clearly during this process of change. The emotions of this living being were a huge burden to it. Faced with this unexpected gain, Luo Fan could not help but shake his head and smile. At that moment, he no longer cared about the light of heaven and earth. With a sweep of his hand, all the itinerant cultivators who had regained their consciousness and strength were enveloped by the power of the world cluster. All of their strength, power, and even their thoughts were completely frozen. The difference in strength brought about by a realm higher was like the difference between heaven and earth. Luo Fan's current realm was more than just one realm higher than the itinerant cultivators. Under such circumstances, unless all the worlds, and space-time in his world cluster were destroyed, he would not be able to unleash his strength. Otherwise, no matter how many cultivators there were, it was just a matter of whether he wanted to deal with them or not, and how he wanted to deal with them. After the cultivators were completely frozen, He did not hesitate to use the power of the world cluster to pull the worlds, and space-time that had been destroyed by the itinerant cultivators out of the river of time. He directly appeared in the world cluster and mended the world cluster, making it complete again. For Luo Fan, this change was equivalent to making up for what he lacked. It was nothing much. However, for the itinerant cultivators, it was an indescribable sense of despair. They had paid a huge price and even put themselves in, but the impact they had caused had disappeared in the blink of an eye. The damage they had caused had been restored in an instant. To them, this situation was simply a blatant mockery. It was a slap in the face without holding back. It went without saying how much despair they felt and how unbearable it was. The emotions of despair continued to be transmitted to the emotional spacetime through the mysterious connection. It kept increasing the power of the emotional spacetime, causing the emotional spacetime to resist the light of heaven and earth even more strongly. At that moment, the pressure on the light of heaven and earth became even more terrifying. However, this was not entirely a bad thing for the light of heaven and earth. It was not only because the increased pressure made it more aware of the negative emotions that tainted its body, but more importantly, these negative emotions used the connection channel between the cultivators and the emotional spacetime in the process of being transmitted into the emotional spacetime. Chapter 2258. Along with this change, the various changes derived from the light of heaven and earth became more and more inclined and targeted. Initially, it would take hundreds of times to get close, but now it only took a few times to reach the same goal. Under such circumstances, in just a few dozen breaths, the barrier around the light of heaven and earth gradually stabilized, as though it had blocked something, and the light began to shine rapidly. At this moment, within the range of the light of heaven and earth, within the emotional spacetime that was like a stone, the replenishment of the emotional spacetime began to weaken rapidly. With this weakening, the emotional spacetime's connection with the many itinerant cultivators in Luo Fan's world group also began to weaken rapidly. Caught? Looking at this scene, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, his expression changed slightly, and an indescribable excitement appeared in his eyes. With a thought, countless pieces of information flowed into his mind through the light of heaven and earth, making him feel as if he understood something, but also as if he didn't understand anything at all. As the owner of the light of heaven and earth, even though the spiritual aura in the light of heaven and earth was at the level of the world's will and he could not understand it at all, this did not affect his authority to control the light of heaven and earth to a certain extent, nor did it affect his ability to receive the various information contained in the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the information he received was none other than the various characteristics of the barrier that separated the light of heaven and earth from the emotional spacetime and the rogue cultivators that he had taken into his own world cluster. In other words, the information he received was actually the information of the mysterious channel that existed between the emotional spacetime and the itinerant cultivators. However, this information seemed extremely messy at this moment, as though countless irregular and unconscious information had piled up and gathered in one place to form a chaotic whole. It went without saying how difficult it was to comprehend such information. In fact, if Luo Fan was not the owner of the light of heaven and earth and the owner of the spiritual aura, he would not have been able to understand this information at all, nor would he have been able to extract the mysteries of the mysterious channel that he needed from this information. Luo Fan's expression became a little dazed as he carefully comprehended the endless information. In his heart there were endless principles, endless profundities, and even more mysteries. How many words, how many diagrams, how many runes, and how many lines that couldn't form into diagrams, words, and runes were constantly wandering, constantly breaking apart, constantly reforming, and constantly interweaving with each other, constantly twisting, and constantly changing. Its level of complexity was simply deeper and more mysterious than all the laws of an entire world, and even the profundities of the Grand Tao. In the face of these countless mysteries, Luo Fan was not the slightest bit discouraged. At every moment, he was trying to understand all of this. He was working hard to study the rules, and he was working hard to refine the mysteries of the mysterious channel that he could understand. Unfortunately, this was simply like an ant facing calculus that could make a university student scratch his head. No matter how hard he tried to look, how hard he tried to break it down, and how hard he tried to reorganize the information according to his own understanding, in the end, all he got was more and more chaotic, more and more difficult to understand, and more deviated from the true essence of the information. This process lasted for an unknown period of time. When the emotional spacetime was completely isolated from the outside world, and when the light of heaven and earth had completely removed all the emotions and senses given by the emotional spacetime, he still didn't gain anything. He could only look at the endless mysterious but complicated information that existed in his mind. At this moment, hundreds of years had passed since he started to sort out the information. Of course, this was only his own time. In fact, for everything else in the creation power, their time was independent. It was the same for the light of heaven and earth, the emotional spacetime within the light of heaven and earth, and even for his own world cluster. In this way, hundreds of years had passed for him, but to the light of heaven and earth, the emotional spacetime, and his own world cluster, only a few days had passed. It's actually so complicated. If this spiritual aura could turn into the will of heaven and earth, the situation would definitely be much better. What a pity! After a long time, Luo Fan sighed slightly with a disappointed look on his face. Given his level, it was almost impossible for him to truly understand the will of heaven and earth, even if it was just the spiritual aura of the will of heaven and earth. In other words, it was almost impossible for him to directly understand the mysteries of the light of heaven and earth, completely understand the information they released, and even understand their emotions, regardless of whether the will in the light of heaven and earth was of the spiritual aura or the level of the will of heaven and earth. However, this did not mean that what Luo Fan said was wrong. It did not mean that the transformation of the spiritual aura within the light of heaven and earth into the will of heaven and earth was not beneficial for him to understand the information. On the contrary, this change was of utmost importance to him. It was enough for him to do things that he could not do even after hundreds of years. This was because compared to the spiritual aura, the will of heaven and earth was more complete, more mellow, and more powerful. This kind of existence already had the ability to convert information that living beings originally could not understand into information that living beings could barely understand through various transformations, reductions, and changes from various angles. In this case, when it passed this information to Luo Fan would naturally have the opportunity and ability to understand this information. He would be able to understand the existence of this information, the existence of the emotional spacetime, and the other rogue cultivators that existed in this information. Sighing in his heart, Luo Fan could only put this matter aside for now. With a wave of his hand, the many itinerant cultivators in his world cluster that had been imprisoned by the power of the world cluster turned into rays of light and shot out of the world cluster. At first, the itinerant cultivators did not know what Luo Fan was going to do. They only thought that he was going to inflict some kind of punishment on them, and that they were going to be cut into pieces in the next instant. However, they soon felt that they had passed through layers of barriers, and seemed to have entered an extremely familiar place that resonated strongly with them. This kind of place made them feel as if they had returned to their home, to the place where they felt the warmest and most secure. What's going on? Why does this place look like my world cluster? This was what the itinerant cultivators thought. Every inch of the place they had entered, every bit of aura, every wisp of power, and every wisp of might, indicated that this was their world cluster. It was a world cluster that was pulled out from their past experiences and their own river of time, and then combined with the power of creation to give birth to it. No matter which angle they observed, sensed, or deduced from, everything pointed to this being the case. However, it was a pity that after being toyed with by Luo Fan for such a long time, none of them dared to believe that this was the case. They dared not believe that Luo Fan was really sending them back to their own world cluster. It was precisely because of this that there was an indescribable doubt in their hearts, no matter what they saw. They did not dare to believe their own guesses, and they were all searching for the slightest flaw in the extremely familiar and incomparably safe existence around them. This looks like my world cluster no matter how I look at it. What is he plotting? Finally, after countless calculations, some itinerant cultivators confirmed that their surroundings were indeed their world cluster, and they could not help but be extremely shocked. Their eyes were filled with intense shock and uncertainty. After returning to their own world cluster, the itinerant cultivators naturally began to take action. They began to control their own world cluster, and began to gather the power of the world cluster. They began to manipulate the power of the countless heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time in the world cluster, and tried their best to gather them in one place to protect and strengthen themselves. The entire process was so smooth that the itinerant cultivators even felt as though they had regained their freedom, as though they had returned to the comfort they had when they first formed their own world cluster. The entire process of being thrown into the cycle of reincarnation and being tortured seemed like something that had happened in their previous lives. In an instant, the confidence of the itinerant cultivators that had been completely shattered began to recover. One by one, they began to change their originally disheveled appearance, and gradually became spirited. No matter what you're plotting, letting me take back my power is the biggest mistake you've made. The itinerant cultivators began to have similar thoughts. Their expressions revealed an indescribable determination, as though they were ready to tear a piece of flesh from Luo Fan's body at any time. At this moment, Luo Fan was outside the whirlpool. With a glance, he could see everything within the whirlpool, within his world group, and outside the world group, as well as the countless worlds that were glued to the world group above the world group. All of it entered his eyes. He also sensed the changes in the aura and mental state of the itinerant cultivators. Seeing this, he only smiled faintly. He did not begin to carry out his so-called plot as the itinerant cultivators thought. "I don't need you guys anymore," he mumbled with a meaningful look in his eyes. Those rogue cultivators gathered the power and might of their own worlds, as well as the various achievements they had made in their lifetime of cultivation. They were ready to fight Luo Fan to the death, or even to perish together with him. However, in the end, after waiting for a long time, everything remained peaceful. It was as though they had truly regained their freedom, and had truly regained everything they had, breaking free from the shackles of Luo Fan. Did he really give up? The itinerant cultivators began to have such thoughts. As they thought of this, their expressions became even more bewildered and uncertain. They were unwilling to believe that Luo Fan had given up on controlling them and allowed them to regain their freedom. After all, they were all fourth tribulation powerhouses. Given how Luo Fan had captured them and thrown them into his world cluster, there was no way he would let them off so easily. In particular, they did not escape because Luo Fan's cultivation had come to an end. Instead, they relied on the power from the emotional spacetime to escape. This clearly meant that Luo Fan's cultivation had not been completed. This meant that their previous actions had disrupted some sort of cultivation of Luo Fan's. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan released them and allowed them to regain their freedom, wouldn't it mean that he had given up halfway through his cultivation? Under such circumstances, one only needed to think for a moment to know that this was almost impossible. However, according to logic, the impossible had clearly happened. That powerhouse seemed to have really stopped caring about them. It was as though he had completely allowed them to act according to their own thoughts, and will. How could this be explained? While the itinerant cultivators were bewildered, they began to try and seek answers from others. Therefore, unknowingly, the itinerant cultivators interacted more and more frequently. In the end, after a few years, all the itinerant cultivators had formed a group. Or rather, they had formed a strange civilization. The wisdom of the masses was boundless. None of the itinerant cultivators could guess what Luo Fan was thinking on their own. However, when they gathered together and gathered the wisdom of many itinerant cultivators, they finally grasped a clue and found the most likely possibility. That powerhouse, Luo Fan, had already stepped into another level of cultivation. They no longer needed to be deceived into reincarnating in a certain place, a certain world, or a certain spacetime. Just moving around, cultivating, and exploring in their own world cluster was enough for him to get what he wanted. This situation was clearly beyond their understanding. Even though they had guessed all this, they could not think of any way to deal with it. Among them, the most plausible solution was suggested by some itinerant cultivators. They were to move their own world cluster out of the vortex, leave this area, and disconnect from the powerhouse's world cluster. However, this was an impossible task for almost all itinerant cultivators. Just moving the world cluster was already something that most rogue cultivators could not do, not to mention the huge vortex of creation energy outside and the huge world cluster in the center that was binding them. Chapter 2259. Under such circumstances, the hearts of the wandering cultivators were filled with shock and bewilderment. Although they looked normal on the surface, and they were all diligently exploring, searching, and cultivating, they were actually empty in their hearts. There was nothing that could support them. Under such circumstances, they naturally became extremely agitated. The friction and conflicts between the wandering cultivators began to increase. It was just like how ordinary people would easily lose their temper when they were in a bad mood and easily vent their anger on others. No matter how strong these wandering cultivators were, they were still living beings, and they could not avoid the emotions of living beings. Thus, things like venting their anger on others would naturally happen. Of course, they were wandering cultivators after all. When they vented their anger on others, they would be more subtle than ordinary people. There were fewer traces of it, and they behaved more naturally. For example, if ordinary people wanted to vent their anger on others, they might directly vent their anger on them because the way others looked at them had touched a certain taboo in their heart. However, when one reached the level of a fourth tribulation cultivator, their venting of anger would not be so shallow. At this level, each and every one of their actions would have countless reasons and objectives. They would even have extremely profound guiding thoughts and their own cultivation path supporting them from behind. Therefore, their anger naturally seemed to be caused by the conflict between their paths of cultivation. For example, there were conflicting goals and so on. In any case, all kinds of seemingly inevitable actions would cause conflict between them. In the end, they would stand against each other, fight, and finally achieve this effect of venting their anger. The reason why it was said that they were still venting their anger was because if they were in a normal state of mind and emotions, they would have cut off all these conflicts from the very beginning. Even if there was no solution, there would have been other ways to solve it in the end. They would not have allowed things to develop to a completely opposing level. After all, at this level, every action of theirs could cause a scene that could destroy the heavens and the earth. Whether it was to themselves, others, or the environment, it would cause great damage. Thus, normally speaking, existences at this level would not fight if they could avoid it. They would naturally do their best to alleviate conflicts that they could. Almost any cultivator who had reached a certain level would have this kind of awareness. This was also an important reason why the worlds and spacetime that contained so many powerful cultivators that could destroy the heavens and the earth would only appear when a tribulation arrived. Only then would the cycle of reincarnation begin. If they did not have this kind of awareness with their strength, as long as two of them were in the same world, they would be able to destroy the world once a day. The appearance of venting of anger caused conflicts between the various world clusters. The wandering cultivators controlled their own world clusters and constantly probed the other world clusters, causing more and more conflicts with the other world clusters. In the beginning, the world clusters merely sent all the powerful living beings into the other world clusters to seize certain things and cause destruction. Then, as the conflict developed, it turned into armies, and then into space-time zones, worlds. In the end, it was an all-out confrontation between the two world clusters. For the rulers of these world clusters, it was naturally almost impossible to move the entire world cluster under the restrictions of the vortex. However, this did not mean that they could not move the heavens and earth, worlds, and space-time within the world cluster. In fact, it was the opposite. To them, moving these things could not be any easier. If they could not move the heavens and earth, worlds, and space-time, how could they adjust their own world clusters and make the operation of their world clusters more in line with their own cultivation paths? Therefore, the scale of the war that was progressing gradually began to advance without any obstacles at all. By the time all the wandering cultivators came to their senses, millions of years had passed. By this time, the boundaries between all the world clusters had become blurred. The heavens and earth, worlds, and space-time within all the world clusters had already established some kind of connection with the heavens and earth, worlds, and space-time that should not have been established in the first place. Some were hostile, some were friendly, some were karma, and some were destiny. All sorts of things had caused all the worlds to unknowingly become an inseparable entity. How did it develop to this stage? When one of the wandering cultivators suddenly came to his senses and looked at the vortex and the countless world clusters for the first time in millions of years, he let out a shriek that seemed to topple his worldview. His world clusters were pulled out from the river of time and represented the combination of all the heavens and earth, worlds, and space-time that he had opened up in the past, whether intentionally or not, to form a whole. For any cultivator, such a world cluster could be said to be independent and self-contained. Under such circumstances, any world cluster of cultivators should be in existence with a natural chasm between other cultivators. No matter what happened, its autonomy should be guaranteed. How was it possible that such a fundamental principle was broken in just millions of years? How was it possible that their world clusters had suddenly connected, and could no longer be seen as individual world clusters, but as a huge, complete world cluster? The wandering cultivator looked at the vast world cluster that was formed from countless wandering cultivators' world clusters in front of him with a shocked expression. His eyes were filled with disbelief as he mumbled, "How is this possible? The world clusters represent my entire past, and now they're connected to the other world clusters. Doesn't this mean that my river of time has already merged with the other wandering cultivators and become a whole? I'm no longer myself, but a part of a whole?" He murmured. Even his attacks and defenses against his enemies' attacks had completely stopped. His actions had attracted the attention of his enemies, causing them to be both delighted and bewildered. What's going on with him? Why is he screaming all of a sudden? How did things develop to this stage? Could it be because of our relationship? One of the enemies thought to himself with a ferocious look in his eyes. When he thought of this last guess, he felt enraged. Millions of years of fighting was enough to form countless conflicts between them. With all these contradictions piled up, they would naturally turn into enemies. For the wandering cultivator, as long as he thought about it, he would be able to remember what the other party had done to him over the past millions of years. He would remember the countless attacks the wandering cultivator had launched against him over the past millions of years. He would remember how the wandering cultivator had destroyed countless places, worlds, and space-time. When he thought of this, he tossed everything else to the back of his mind. All he wanted to do was to destroy this cultivator, and he didn't care about why this cultivator was screaming, hesitating, or at a loss. Despite the situation, the wandering cultivator did not care and continued to attack. He used all the power in the entire world cluster to suppress his enemy, the wandering cultivator who first came to his senses. One did not resist or attack, while the other used all of his strength and might to attack. The final result could be imagined. In just a short period of time, the wandering cultivator who first came to his senses had his entire world cluster destroyed. Not even the slightest trace of him remained, leaving him alone in the void, facing the ruins formed from the destruction of his own world cluster, and the enemy who had just destroyed him, the one who had fought him for millions of years. You've finally fallen into my hands. Finally, I can return all the pain I've suffered over the years to you. The enemy looked at the wandering cultivator with a ferocious expression. Pride and killing intent surged from his body. It even turned into countless places, worlds, and space-time that surged around his body. Don't you find it strange at all? The wandering cultivator who first came to his senses asked in a daze. At this moment, his eyes seemed empty and empty. Vaguely, it was as if he had seen through the countless truths hidden in the fog. Just by standing there quietly, an awe-inspiring and inviolable aura naturally emerged. Seeing his strange behavior, the enemy sneered. Strange, how did you lose so quickly? No, I don't find it strange at all, and I don't want to know the reason. All I know is that you must die, and die a miserable death. Hearing this, the wandering cultivator who first came to his senses suddenly laughed. At this moment, the hostility and killing intent that had accumulated in his heart for millions of years seemed to have disappeared without a trace. The transcendence from millions of years ago reappeared on his body. Of course, I'm not asking you to find it strange. I just want to ask you, don't you find it strange that I'm still alive, that my memory is not damaged, and that I haven't lost anything in the past? The wandering cultivator asked calmly. His eyes showed a hint of realization, and there was a deep sense of despair. The enemy's body trembled. Then, he looked around. Apart from the power of his world cluster and the power of his world cluster, there was also the endless ruins left behind by the wandering cultivator's world cluster. As he saw everything around him clearly, the anger and killing intent in his eyes completely disappeared, and what replaced it was a kind of disbelief. How could this be? Your world cluster is gone. Why haven't you become a walking dead? Why are you still alive? The enemy finally came to his senses and exclaimed. Hearing this, the wandering cultivator who first came to his senses laughed and said, "You'll know what's going on when you look again." His smile seemed normal and joyful, but it actually contained the deepest despair. A despair that all his hopes, all his efforts, and all his goals had disappeared. At this moment, the enemy had a deeper understanding of the transcendence displayed by the independent cultivator in front of him. He knew that it was not true transcendence at all, but a feeling of transcendence produced by the deepest despair in the depths of one's heart. When things reached an extreme, they would move in the opposite direction. Understanding this, the enemy could not help but feel his hair stand on end. He felt as if a huge shadow had shrouded him, making him almost breathless. At this moment, how could he still care about the conflict and hatred between himself and the wandering cultivator? He hurriedly looked around in all directions, carefully identifying the things that he had originally overlooked. After all, he was a cultivator at the 4th level of the road of Tao Master, an existence that could already become a 4th tribulation expert. When his mind was deceived, he would ignore many things. But once he came to his senses, the things that he had originally ignored would naturally be seen again. Soon, he discovered what the rogue cultivator had discovered. All the cosmos clusters had been connected, and all the barriers and boundaries between the cosmos clusters had been blurred. When he discovered this, his expression instantly changed. How could this be? How could the world cluster, which is incomparably independent, be mixed up with other world clusters? If that's the case, what am I? Could it be that I've become a part of a more powerful being? His voice was like a thunderclap that shook the heavens. As a fourth tribulation expert, the power of his own divine sense had long reached an incredible level. With such power, when he shouted without any scruples, his voice would naturally obtain the power that he himself possessed. Thus, it would naturally obtain an unimaginable transmission ability. In this way, his roar directly spread throughout the world clusters of the wandering cultivators, and into the ears of the countless wandering cultivators who were still fighting fiercely at this moment. Even if the hearts of the wandering cultivators were obscured by hatred, even if they wanted to kill their current enemies, they could not deny the fact that they were fourth tribulation experts, and the fact that they were seeking to become true saints. Under such circumstances, when the roar reached their ears, the key information was naturally received by them, and they were directly awakened from the countless emotions that had been concealing them. For a moment, the world clusters became completely silent. The originally extremely violent scenes, the originally extremely chaotic scenes, all became deathly silent at this moment. It was as if an invisible hand had suddenly pressed a switch that controlled everything, stopping the evolution of everything and stopping everything. What is he saying? What world clusters are mixed up? What losing oneself? He's crazy. Chapter 2260. All sorts of complicated emotions welled up in the hearts of the itinerant cultivators. All of them tossed their conflicts with other itinerant cultivators to the back of their minds and focused on the state of the various world clusters, as well as their own state. As itinerant cultivators who already had their own world clusters, they knew very well what a world cluster represented. They also knew very well what would happen if a world cluster underwent such a change. Under such circumstances, they were even more unwilling to accept such an outcome. We've even lost our independence. What are we now? Someone's clone? Projection? This was the deepest worry in the hearts of the itinerant cultivators. The itinerant cultivator who first came to his senses said plainly to his enemy, "Looks like you've understood. It's a pity that we've all understood too late, including me." The enemy was in the same state as he was before. He was in disbelief, his worldview was overturned, and he was filled with rage, madness, rage, and despair. Looking at the enemy whom he had originally hated so much that he wanted to skin and pull out his tendons, the itinerant cultivator did not feel the slightest bit of joy. All he felt was a sense of empathy and sorrow. A sorrow as if he was looking at his own reflection in the mirror compared to their own fates, their own futures, and even their own independence. What were the accumulated conflicts over the past tens of millions of years? It was not just here. Similar things were happening in other locations among the other itinerant cultivators. The goal that they had spent all their memories pursuing seemed to have become insignificant at this moment. The goal that they were willing to make great sacrifices to achieve seemed to have become tasteless at this moment. They could not even take it seriously anymore. "This must be that powerhouse's scheme," one of the itinerant cultivators mumbled. He spoke the truth that was clearly in the hearts of all the itinerant cultivators, but none of them dared to say it out loud. His words caused the expressions of all the itinerant cultivators to turn extremely ugly. They could not help but turn their gazes in another direction. It was the direction of the center of an incomparably huge vortex of creation energy. In other words, at the center surrounded by many world clusters, there was a world cluster that had an extremely strange relationship with the other world clusters. It seemed to be a mix, but it also seemed to be fundamentally different. We've already come this far. What else can we lose? A loose cultivator murmured. The self was the most fundamental and important existence for all cultivators. It could even be said that it was the last existence they had. They could lose everything else, even their cultivation, their world clusters. As long as they existed, their lives would exist, and they would have the chance to rise again, to transcend once more. However, once one lost their sense of self, even if everything else existed, even if one's strength increased to an unbelievable level, it would still be equivalent to having nothing at all. Because if you don't even own yourself, how can your things be considered yours no matter how much you have? Under such circumstances, losing their independence was equivalent to losing everything for the countless itinerant cultivators. In that case, what else did they have to worry about? What else was there to fear? More and more rogue cultivators realized this fact. At this moment, their expressions changed, and they turned to look at the group of worlds in the center of the vortex. They turned to look at the culprit who caused them to fall into such a desperate situation. Soon after, the rogue cultivators began to move. They directly abandoned the worlds or other forces that they had been protecting or dealing with. They turned into various existences and shot toward the group of worlds in the center of the vortex. Among them, the most resolute one was the first rogue cultivator who came to his senses. In other words, he was the rogue cultivator whose world cluster had been completely destroyed by his enemy. Because he still existed even though the world cluster had been destroyed, he clearly knew that he did not need the world cluster to do everything that could be done with the world cluster. He clearly knew that even if the world cluster was completely destroyed, he would not be harmed at all. Knowing this, he would naturally erupt with the greatest determination. He would display the most resolute attitude and launch the most powerful vengeance against his true enemy. At this moment, outside the vortex, Luo Fan, who had not moved for many years, moved again. He lifted his eyes and looked at the cluster of worlds that had mostly fused together in the vortex beside him. For the many worlds in the vortex, tens of millions of years had passed. However, because time was relatively independent between the creation energy in the outside world, to Luo Fan only a few years had passed. In the past few years, he did not pay much attention to the many worlds in the vortex or the changes between the rogue cultivators. Instead, he only paid attention to the battle between the worldly light and the emotional spacetime in front of him. After all, to him, even if the battle between the many worlds and the rogue cultivators in the vortex reached its most intense stage, it was still under his control. It was impossible for it to escape his control. In fact, even the final outcome was due to his arrangements. From the beginning until now, it was absolutely impossible for there to be any deviation or change. Under such circumstances, wasn't it the same as entertaining himself to pay attention to the situation inside the vortex? In comparison, the battle between the worldly light and the emotional spacetime was completely different. The worldly light had a spiritual aura that had completely recovered to the level of the world will. It could automatically evolve corresponding changes according to the situation it faced. The emotional spacetime was not low either, and it could also evolve corresponding measures according to the various changes of the worldly light. In this way, the battle between the two was equivalent to a battle of wits and courage between two existences that were almost at the level of the world will. One could imagine how exciting it was. It could be said that the changes that occurred at every moment were beyond the scope of the wisdom and understanding of living beings. The various mysteries of cultivation were enough to broaden the horizons of any cultivator, and they could even comprehend the various mysteries that would have taken billions of years to comprehend. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan not pay attention to the battle between the worldly light and the emotional spacetime? What the rogue cultivators perceived as tens of millions of years was only a few years to him. The corresponding changes displayed by the worldly light were calculated in billions of trillions, and the changes displayed by the emotional spacetime were exactly the same. Even so, the emotional spacetime retreated under the various attacks of the worldly light. Now, most of the emotional spacetime had been invaded by the worldly light and was stained with the color of the worldly light. Inside the emotional spacetime, there were countless strange worlds, and spacetime being born at every moment. They were then thrown into the boundary between the contaminated spacetime and the original normal spacetime. Countless extremely intense and mysterious conflicts formed as if all coincidences were condensed in one place. As the various fluctuations and auras were born, they continuously exploded and overlap. In the end, they transformed into waves of destructive waves that either pushed the emotional spacetime back or pushed the erosion of the worldly light further. The final result was that the area eroded by the worldly light continued to push toward the entire emotional spacetime. Of course, this seemed to be a natural outcome, but it was impossible for it to be smooth sailing. After all, the opponent of the worldly light was the emotional spacetime that could even occupy a position in the state of chaos if it grew. Although such an existence was much weaker than the worldly light condensed by Luo Fan due to its foundation and growth, it was not a weak existence. If the worldly light wanted to defeat it, it would have to pay a considerable price. Therefore, the emotional spacetime was constantly eroded in this process, and the worldly light was also under unimaginable pressure. Under this pressure, countless worldly light collapsed and turned into powder in the battle with the emotional spacetime. They were either collected by the worldly light again, or completely devoured and destroyed by the emotional spacetime. Fortunately, the spiritual aura in the worldly light had recovered to the level of the will of heaven and earth, so it could deal with all kinds of situations perfectly. Therefore, even if it encountered such a huge pressure, even if it suffered all kinds of damage caused by the emotional spacetime in the process, it could still do its best to digest all kinds of experiences and even turn them into resources for its own growth, so that it could absorb the nutrients it needed in the process, and then obtain new improvement. Over the years, the spiritual aura of the light of the heavens and earth had unknowingly undergone a subtle change. It was as if something had been triggered and was about to brew a new change. This kind of change naturally made Luo Fan secretly surprised. After all, he had originally planned that the worldly light would not be able to complete the fourth level of the road to Tao Master, but now it seemed that there was still a chance. After confirming that this change might be the evolution of the spiritual aura to the real will of heaven and earth, Luo Fan naturally had countless thoughts, and vaguely understood why this change had occurred. If a person was forced, his own potential would be stimulated. By extension, the will of all living creatures was similar. Once a person was lazy, even things that could be done originally would become impossible. Once a person was really under great pressure, even things that could be done originally would become possible. This was naturally the case for the spiritual aura at the level of the will of heaven and earth. It was the same for the spiritual aura. If it was always in a state of absolute invincibility, and everything in front of it could be easily solved in a few short evolutions, then even if it had the potential to sublimate and transform, it would not be able to exert its potential and even gradually sink. But now, it was facing the emotional spacetime that could pose a threat to it, and if it was not careful, it could even directly form a strong oppression on it. Under the oppression of such a strong opponent, how could the worldly light slack off? How could it not stimulate its own potential? In this way, it naturally stimulated the metamorphosis potential it possessed, allowing it to begin the process of evolving towards the will of the heavens and earth. Of course, the emotional spacetime was, after all, weaker than the worldly light. Therefore, the pressure was only enough to start the process, but it was still impossible for the evolution process to be completed quickly. Therefore, although a few years had passed, the spiritual aura was still showing signs of transformation, and the real transformation had not been completed. I have to increase the pressure. If this continues, let alone a few years, even tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years wouldn't be enough to complete this transformation. Measuring the speed of the transformation of the light of the world, Luo Fan came to this conclusion. With such a judgment, he turned his gaze towards the huge vortex beside him, looking at the countless worlds that had already fused into a single mass within the vortex. Maybe I can find a way from them. Looking at the numerous individual cultivators who were rushing towards his world group without any regard for their own safety, Luo Fan was slightly moved. The individual strength of these individual cultivators was not enough for him, and even if all of them gathered together, they would not be able to bring much pressure to him. However, they represented the main body of the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path. Their existence itself already represented a fundamental law of the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path. Normally, these rules wouldn't have much meaning. Even for those rogue cultivators, these fundamental rules wouldn't have much meaning and wouldn't bring them much benefit. However, for Luo Fan, as long as he made certain adjustments and changes, he would be able to transform this kind of rule into a powerful power, transforming it into a kind of monstrous momentum. It was just like when the individual cultivators from the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path pushed the disciples of the Tao Sovereign's path down into the abyss, and became their master, in order to obtain a great boost and greatly increase their cultivation speed. In fact, if Luo Fan was willing, he could actually obtain a great boost from the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path, just like what the individual cultivators did in the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path, and increase his cultivation speed. After all, he had already controlled the entire fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path, both the disciples of the Tao Sovereign's path and the individual cultivators, restricting them within the range of his own world group. In this way, his control over the fourth level was even stronger and more profound than that of the individual cultivators on the third level. How could he not be able to do what the individual cultivators on the third level had done? However, compared to obtaining the boost from the fourth level, he was more willing to use this method to make use of the countless individual cultivators and disciples of the Tao Sovereign's path, which was why he did not activate the boost. It was not that he could not do it. Kill! At this moment, the numerous individual cultivators had already rushed to the front of the numerous world group that had yet to merge. They began to madly charge in, directly tearing apart everything that stood in their way, and began to create endless slaughter and destruction. The individual cultivators that had already merged with the world group were not all the individual cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path. They were just the individual cultivators that provided resources for the growth of the emotional spacetime after it was born. Therefore, at this moment, there were still many world group of the Tao Sovereign's path and individual cultivators around Luo Fan's world group. They were stacked like a beehive, isolating his world group from the boundless world group outside. If the individual cultivators really wanted to come into contact with Luo Fan's world group, they would have to first go through the countless world group of the Tao Sovereign's path and individual cultivators. Although the owners of those world group had all been thrown into the endless reincarnation of the world group by Luo Fan to provide power for the growth of the world group, but they were not dead. However, they did not die. Back then, Luo Fan still left a strong enough battle instinct in their world cluster. Therefore, in the face of this external threat, the world group erupted with unimaginable resistance. The power of countless world, and space-time gathered towards the individual cultivators from all directions, forming countless layers of defense in front of the individual cultivators. Looking from afar, the places where the rogue cultivators passed by were like countless fireworks exploding, producing clouds of turbid smoke that continuously spread in all directions. In the end, only the sky, the earth, the world, and the space-time were left in ruins, as well as endless resentment and killing intent left behind in the places where they passed, forming a bloody and tragic trail. Each of the individual cultivators was an unimaginably terrifying existence in any world, or space-time, and could easily destroy the world. For them, unless there was the power of the world group in front of them, all the power in the normal world group was just a matter of how many moves there were.